All right, we are live. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Authoritarian Ends Part 2 Roundtable Boogaloo. And we're here with a small gathering, somewhat, of folks who have agreed to be a part of this expanded version of Authoritarian and Authoritarian Different Ends. We have with us again Ray, and Nero should be joining us shortly, but we also have Enver, who I believe is going to be sort of another one of Ray's comrades, something like that, and joining me to argue for an ostensibly right-wing outlook will be Ghost of Watts. So, how you guys doing?
Doing great.
Feeling pretty right-wing today.
All right. So first and foremost, as with the last stream, I think we have to start off addressing shall we address some of AA's tweets? Ray, I think you had some qualms about some of his post-stream assessments.
Yeah, Academic Asian has been at it again. It's kind of like have you ever seen that postcard meme where it goes something like, it has like a little girl and she's eating crackers or something, and the subtitle is something like, when you really hate someone, no matter what the girl does, you just hate what she does. And then it has like a quotation, look at that bitch eating those crackers like she owns the place. Yeah, that's basically how it is. So I can say literally anything, and there'll be just like absolute outrage coming from that quarter, no matter what it happens to be. I can even actually recite back to them their own words, but using my own voice, and they would probably disagree with it.
So that increasingly seems to be the case, as much as I would like it not to be, because I still think AA has some valuable insights on certain topics. But all right, shall we address at least some of the tweets that you thought were the most worthy of being discussed here?
Yeah, but rather than quoting the tweets directly, I've just basically distilled them down to the 4 things that they disagree with, because it'd be kind of tiring to just quote tweet after tweet of them essentially,
the threads
questioning my intelligence.
Sure, yeah.
So I'll just skim through it, and much of it will sound like stuff we already said yesterday, because of the fact that what they're doing is they're essentially just using the least amount of charity to interpret my statements from yesterday as possible, which is typical. So, okay, I was accused of making the automation fallacy, apparently. I didn't realize I was making an automation fallacy, given that I went into that interview explicitly with the intention of not committing that fallacy. So I'm just going to reiterate myself, except I'm going to do it by quoting someone else. So appeal to authority is what's happening now instead. So I'm quoting from an article titled, Could a Robot Ever Replace You?, which had several different marketing executives from big companies were giving their opinions on this, and I settled on the fact that Chris Patton, who is the UK and Ireland head of marketing at Fujitsu, I settled on the idea that he was the correct one, and this was published in The Drum, who make a magazine, and they're a big marketing thing. I'm sure you guys know who they are anyway. So I'm just going to quote him. Quote, instead of replacing humans, robots will coexist with us. I envision a seamless interface with artificial intelligence-based technologies, let's call it AI harmony, where, through technology, workers will take increasingly creative roles because they have the chance to delegate repetitive and laborious tasks. We will also see an abundance of Alexa-type technologies in the workplace supporting people in their day-to-day work. In fact, a recent Fujitsu report showed that if half of UK business leaders have already implemented AI or plan to in the next 12 months. This is a testimony to the future of work and innovation. As more people are exposed to cutting-edge technology, be it at home or in the workplace, its added value will be better understood and accepted. So, I mean, that doesn't really sound like it's the automation fallacy here. I'm not claiming that automation destroys all jobs that it comes into contact with. I'm simply saying that the jobs which people will end up carrying out will need to be slightly more advanced than they were previously, because most of the repetitive and mundane tasks will eventually be taken away.
Yeah, and
so it's a change in tasks, not necessarily a reduction in jobs.
Yeah, and like we discussed this a little bit yesterday, where it's like there's certainly some empirical evidence to suggest that the creation of these new technologies has resulted in jobs that, or hasn't resulted in the creation of the same amount of jobs as it used to. Like a new technology today where the invention of something like the cotton gin could create something like 12 or 15 new jobs out of its invention. The invention of things like Google and all these search and let's say copyright infringement technologies and things like that, they're only creating 2 jobs now. So
Yeah,
the amount of jobs
it should be
less.
phrased perhaps as not that these things are destroying jobs, but rather that they're exerting a downward pressure on the number of jobs which may be created during a given time period.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I mean, they're also reconfiguring the way that people do jobs that they already have. So it's not that people just suddenly lose jobs completely.
Right.
The second thing which I was seeing people complaining about was that they were upset because of the fact that I talked about an expansion of, well, what they interpreted as an expansion of the welfare state, except they're complaining about the fact that I was being slightly deceptive because what I'd actually described was an overall tax cut. Now, you'd think that they would not be upset by this, right? Because, literally, I stand accused of basically using leftist verbiage to conceal the fact that I'm propagating the logic of a tax cut.
Well, it's
Okay,
okay.
I mean, maybe I should just cop to that, so I'm going to do that right now. So, the use of corporation tax and land tax is what I was saying. That basically you could cut all taxes except corporation tax and land tax, right? And then you could go forward from there. I was asked the reason why I chose corporation tax. The reason why I chose corporation tax and land tax rather than any 2 other taxes that you could have kept is because of the fact that if you're talking about automation, which we were in that live stream, the best way to capture the fruits for the profits of automation is to keep corporation tax and land tax in effect. Why? Because you can't reap it if you were to do payroll tax, for example, or VAT. Like, we know that's actually impossible.
Mm-hmm. Well,
You
I
know,
think. Sorry,
there's
go ahead.
actually a very curious thing that I was working on recently. I was covering the Fed monetary policy hearing in the House, and one guy brought up, well, automation is kind of like, you know, what you just mentioned. It's cutting down, it's putting a downward pressure on the amount of jobs that might be available, and the question was, how does this interact with the Fed's mandate for full employment? And I think that's something no one's really thought about, except in the context of a of testimony on the topic.
Would you say that the mandate should be altered?
No, the Fed, or at least the Fed chair, said, "Oh, this is a problem for Congress, but we're closely watching it." But it is kind of like an interesting question, because if Congress doesn't address it, which, I mean, knowing Congress, there's a pretty good chance of that. What the Fed might do, given their legal responsibilities, that they might like the tools of monetary policy, I don't think are really apt to fix that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. Yeah.
Yeah, monetary policy. One of the things I've actually been looking into just myself to just address this little tangent is that when you read the readings of people like Bernanke and Manicu, they talk about the shrinking effect of things like monetary policy because it's become less of a signal in and of itself and more of an indicator of general overall economic health. And so when you look to it, it's not something, it's like if you raise interest rates a little bit, it's not necessarily the indicator that, it's time for you to buy because of, this rate of return based on this rate of interest. It's more so just addressing the fact that, well, all right, we think the economy is now good enough to finally raise it. So it's sort of like the Fed's adjusting a policy to sort of catch up with the state of the stock market and the overall economy, as opposed to it sort of dictating it itself.
Oh yeah, because monetary policy, at least these days, is trying to be reactive. Of course, it was always reactive, but the issue was that they kind of pretended, oh, this is a market rate. We're just doing what the market says is like what it would be free floating, but obviously it was reactive. And at least, who was it? Bernanke said that it was bullshit. But yeah, whatever. Continue on automation, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, to finish that point too, then I'll say that in the present situation, most of our taxes are falling on consumption through value-added tax and stuff like this, or sales tax, as they call it in the US, which is a regressive form of taxation, obviously, and I don't need to explain why that is so. And human work, which is payroll tax, of course, or national insurance, or what do they call it elsewhere? I'm sure you will know what I'm talking about. So,
employment insurance?
yeah, anything like that. And so taxing work and not taxing rising property values creates a perverse incentive to invest in property and not work. Letting private owners reap the most of the rewards of public infrastructure investment restricts the optimal scale of major projects, and ultimately the whole economy would lose from that. This case rests not just on claims of fairness or petty moralism, but on economic efficiency, right? So I do not understand why it is that they were so upset that I was saying that you should just remove all of the taxes, but leave corporation tax and land tax in place. Those are actually the two most logical taxes you would leave in place if you actually cared about the working class while cutting taxes. And simplifying the tax code, reducing administrative overhead, and then repurposing the savings from your administrative overhead for more spending on things that you actually want to spend money on.
Well,
so
I
these
think
people talk about efficiency savings all the time, but when someone actually comes to them and says, "Here's some efficiency savings," they're really upset.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that their big complaint was that one, I don't think they got the point that you were sort of advocating for a net tax reduction, but I
Oh
think
no, I even explained it to them, and when they objected to it on Twitter, I actually went to them and explained to them that this is actually a net tax reduction. They still maintained that this would crash the economy somehow.
yeah, well, I think what their claim is that so almost that you're lying in a sense because the programs you're suggesting that with to instill, which were like along sort of social democrat kind of lines in the vein of
Yeah.
expanded Medicare and expanded other government programs. I
Yes,
think
but
in
I'm
their
also
mind,
calling for all of these programs to be rolled into one, and we've seen that this actually results in savings because Universal Credit in the United Kingdom is going to deliver 35 billion of savings over the next 10 years because it's 6 different programs combined into one, which has reduced the overhead.
yeah, no,
So,
I
I mean,
think
if you had rising profits off of increased automation and increased productivity, and you had savings from combining different programs into one program, you'd be able to fund this thing without having to have more taxes than you were paying before. You would definitely have a net tax decrease.
Well, you're not going to convince them of the efficiency of the plan because the position that someone like AA is coming from is not from a position of, well, what is the end result going to be? Their position is the Austrian style of objective private property rights, and does this negatively affect objective private property rights? And any sort of tax or anything is going to do that in their mind. So I don't think they'll be convinced of it, no matter how many tax cuts you give them or how much you can convince them of its efficiency. They don't care about
yeah,
efficiency.
and I think the second part of it is that it's less so about the efficiency of the programs. It's and almost more about they're under this illusion that any expansion of a government program is going to require an increase in spending in some sense. And so they were making the case that, you claim that you're going to be able to deliver a net tax reduction, but they don't believe you actually would be able to, even though I think there's a case to say that if you're lowering taxes and you eliminate loopholes, you'll actually be able to collect more revenue than if you were to just have the same tax code, raise taxes, but keep all the loopholes, because you would incentivize people to not take those loopholes and just pay your taxes because they're lower anyway now. So what's the point of going out of the way to try and avoid them? It's kind of like the Laffer curve a little bit. If you find this optimal rate of taxation, which most people believe to be on sort of the lower end. And so it's like, you could make the case, even from a supply side standpoint, that what you're doing will increase revenues enough to pay for the programs you're advocating for.
Yes, and the other thing about it that was truly baffling as well, particularly within a British context, is that to defend the status quo on the tax system in Britain is actually not a majority position. I think most policymakers right now will admit to you, if you ask them, that the British tax system is not fit for purpose. So it wasn't like I was saying something that no one else had ever said before in terms of just eliminating stuff that shouldn't be there. But, again, it's basically, when someone hates you, they're going to find anything to complain about. So the next part of this was that the third criticism was a really funny one, so I'm just going to deal with it as quickly as possible. Their other complaint, which is kind of a strange one, is that somehow Amazon, Microsoft, Google, other large conglomerates, Keiretsus and Chayaballs will all take over the government entirely because they will be the ones providing the actual tax receipts. Well, I mean, that is true. I mean, if you have corporation tax and land tax as pretty much your only surviving revenue streams, it does mean that basically corporations are the ones who are actually paying the taxes, right?
Mm.
So they would have influence over the state because of that fact. But of course, they've already had influence over the state, so it's not like I'm really changing anything there. But anyway, we go on. And so they will apparently, quote, crash the economy because they will be too big, like, quote unquote, the British East India Company. So, okay, in my view, this is nonsense. And all we're doing here, really, in my view, is we're just pushing capitalism right up against its structural limits to find out what will happen. If these right-wing populist detractors are actually correct about capitalism, i.e., if they believe that capitalism will go on and on and on forever and ever uninterrupted and will never actually be assailed by a new system or will never transform into another system, then there is no risk in this proposal for them whatsoever because capitalism will always survive anyway. It definitely would not crash, nor would it be transformed into socialism. So from their perspective, actually, there should be nothing to worry about, and they should just stop thinking about this and disregard it completely.
Yeah, well, one of the things I would say about that is I don't get at all the comparison to the Dutch East India Company. A far better comparison would have been to say some of the banks pre 2008 in the United States, where you could sort of make the case that they're too big to fail, but they've only gained that position because government lobbying and special interests, yada yada yada. But even in that context, something like that is almost unavoidable because if you accept the existence of some form of government or the other, you're going to accept the fact that there's going to be some kind of lobbying because on one level or another, the state is a resource. And if all businesses are competing to become a monopoly, essentially, because that's what all businesses are competing to become. They don't want competition. They want to be the top dog in whatever field they're producing in. They're going to use the state to try to become a monopoly anyway. And so there's never going to be this idealized free market scenario that Austrians believe is going to occur because you can't have their ANCAP utopia. And being that the state is a resource, every company that exists is going to try to take advantage of it in some way or another. So you're always going to have this sort of pseudo corporatist kind of jive going on.
And I've also told this to them many times before, that basically the state should not be seen as a separate thing in and of itself. The state is a command tent that everyone else is competing over to have influence in.
The one thing that I would say is that the state, well, the first part is, I think that even if you did not have the state kind of interfering here, capitalism would tend to produce, if not monopolies, economies of scale and large enterprises and so on. And this is something that I don't think is necessarily bad either. Having really large, when you have an economies of scale, it's by definition a more efficient situation. A lot of these monopolies are more efficient because you have you're cutting down on overhead costs. You have two corporations, two corporate headquarters. They merge together. You get one corporate headquarters and quite a lot less administrative costs involved. The other thing I would add is that when like the socialist perspective on tax, I think the thing they were most in the capitalist context, especially today, and more so in the social democratic period from certain perspectives, is kind of seeing it in terms of rent. And the number one thing that I would like to see as a socialist is like a reduction in rent sinking and rent in the economy overall. The bigger goal, the bigger aspiration has always been, let's to use kind of neoliberal language, let's have let's one, change the fiduciary responsibility. This is something that's been I've seen Republicans, for example, go absolutely nuts at the idea that that companies should have any responsibility other than creating shareholder value, even if shareholders say do something else. Where we own you, you should do something else. The state comes and says no, you must create shareholder value. I think that the question of fiduciary responsibility needs to be questioned and changed as the first thing. The other thing would be the goal is less about imposing rent on a bunch of corporations and more repurposing the proceeds of production and value and surplus production towards different things. And I think there's a lot more elegant ways of doing that than a tax, for example. Sovereign wealth funds have been used in a number of natural resource-rich economies. They take advantage of them really well. There's no reason that they can't apply to other modern industrial societies.
Sure, I'm open to that option as well. I mean, I wasn't saying this is the only way to do it. I'm open to those options as well. I've seen that Noah Smith on Twitter, the Bloomberg writer, was also talking about this idea where he created something that looked kind of like a sovereign wealth fund, except it wasn't based on natural resources. I can't remember what he called it though.
Mm-hmm.
It was called what was it called? The Citizens Something Fund, and every citizen of the country would be able to have something. I can't remember how he did it, but it was very elegant when he talked about it.
Mm-hmm. It's I've always found it to be very compelling. Matt Brewing has also done a lot of work on that.
Yes, it was him that he had gotten the idea from.
Oh, that makes sense.
All right, so
so I'm in favor of that too. The fourth thing which was brought up, which was apparently because, as you recall, these guys don't believe in mandatory school for some reason, and so they were really, really upset about the fact that you and I had this conversation, pragmatic, about the increasing age of school leaving, where I said that, at first, during the first wave of development, everyone was mandatorily having to attend primary school, and then eventually it went up where everyone mandatorily had to also attend secondary school. And then I hypothesized that in the future it may be the case that everyone may in fact have to mandatorily attend university, right? Right, so it's just a hypothesis, but apparently this was really upsetting to a lot of people for some reason.
Because then it's a cultural issue.
And they're claiming that I had it backwards. They're claiming that economic development actually happens before the raising of the school leaving age, which I am not sure is correct, because the South Korean experience, for example, and the South Asian experience, i.e. sort of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, would seem to suggest that I am correct. And so I've got a source, obviously. So there's a paper titled "Why is the South Korean Growth Experience Different? An Analysis of the Differences of Per Capita GDP between South Korea and South Asian Countries." Hold on for a second. Kandakar A. Econ Change Restructs 2016. I'll put the link so you guys can look at it themselves and tell me whether I am wrong. And so I'm just going to read the first part of the abstract and then the conclusion, because I can't be bothered to go through the whole thing. We'll be here all evening. So the economic growth of South Korea, particularly from 1962 until now, has been at least outstanding. There have been many explanations of the causes of this remarkable achievement of South Korea, with most of the explanations attributing the rapid industrialization and growth of South Korea to the adoption of an outward-looking strategy by the country in the 1960s. The South Asian countries have been trying to adopt trade-oriented strategies for many years now, but none of these South Asian countries have been able to reach the developed country status yet. And so they go through this whole long paper, essentially trying to figure out why it is so. And so it ends with conclusion. The main factors that have evidently caused the differences in per capita GDP between South Korea, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka on average are labor, per capita human capital, and physical capital. Trade openness is another significant determinant, but their exact effects are not overwhelmingly positive if the marginal effects estimated in this paper are taken into account. Financial liberalization is seen to be impacting differences in per capita physical capital more than differences in per capita GDP, but it is not statistically significant in all specifications. This means that although South Korea and the South Asian countries under study have undergone massive financial liberalization programs and have adopted trade-oriented strategies, South Korea has been more successful in channeling the policies into improving their production technology, employment opportunities, physical capital, and per capita human capital, while the South Asian countries under study have lagged behind on average. This has caused the South Korean economy to grow more than the South Asian countries. Hence, the most important lesson to be learned from the South Korean growth experience is that no matter how much a country increases trade or liberalizes its economy, if the country does not manage to improve its per capita human capital and production technology through these policies, it will not prosper in the long run. I mean, this should be obvious, right? But that's why, if you look at the pattern of development that South Korea underwent in the 1960s, you'll find that the mandatory school system thing and all of the other state interventions in society that caused people to have to sit up and actually do what they're supposed to do were extremely important.
Well, I think there's a couple things I can add just because I've done a little bit of research into this myself. One being that there's more than one way to increase the value of per capita of your human capital. And I think one of the ways countries in the West did that was not primarily through required learning, but rather learning of their own. Like there was apprenticeships, there was hands-on experience like child labor, going out to work in a factory at a young age. And even though it was essentially low skilled work at first, there are the stories of not necessarily the Andrew Carnegies who went from being like mail runners in steel mills to eventually running the steel mills themselves. But there are stories similar to that that happen on a much smaller scale and happen in a much less grand fashion. And I think that's one of the ways that the West was able to increase the value of its human capital. The second thing I would point out is that there's a bit of an interplay between the growth and development of like economic and then the return on investment that you get from that growth in the term of what schooling is necessary. It's very hard to describe which has the correlative effect, whether it's education first that that does what it does to people and allows people to be employed in more gainful positions and thus increase economic output, or whether or not economic output is increased first and then you have the opportunity.
I think it's geographical because you mentioned the West earlier, and I have to point out, when people talk about the West in this context, the era you're talking about was the era of the people who industrialized first. So, for example, the United Kingdom and parts of the United States, the thing that you have said may be true there. But in Germany, for example, it would not necessarily be true because they were in catch-up mode because they were lagging behind. And so then they were forced to actually go about it a very different way. And so the argument that I would make is that Germany and countries which learned from Germany's experience in the late 1880s, I'm just taking that from the top of my head, the countries that learn from that experience and are following on next are the ones that don't have the luxury of being able to kind of trial and error things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would actually agree that historically speaking, yes, it would be the case that for the United Kingdom, for example, no one actually sat down and planned out the educational system that emerged. But for everyone that followed afterwards, they had no choice but to pre-planning because otherwise they would simply be defeated in the market.
Yeah, no, there's, like I said, it depends on geographical location. And somebody pointed out in the chat that it could have a good bit to do with the people themselves, the IQs of the various people. You know, there's some genetic factor and some environmental factors at play here, of course. But the correlation cannot be clearly derived. I would say that economic output leads to greater educational opportunities, or educational opportunities leads to greater economic output. I think there's a very mixed.
And I would also agree, yes, there is a cultural factor involved as well, because obviously in some of these countries, I mean, if you could almost model Germany as being very different from countries that are to the west of its position, for example. And obviously you could model South Korea, Japan, and parts of, and pretty much all of South Asia as being almost like a completely separate.
Yeah, I think Japan is a perfect example, actually, because they have they had that one period after, I believe it was, when Matthew Perry came to visit with the massive battleships from the U.S.
Yes.
And Japan kind of took a step back and went, holy fuck, we got to catch up.
That's the catch-up process. And part of why it had to be done that way also is because of the socialization process. Historically speaking, for many of these countries, the school system was actually a predeterminant of what rank you would hold in society as well. South Korea even more as well, because their entire caste system was actually linked to the performance of the persons in school, going back as far as before industrialization ever happened. So for them, the idea that you would just kind of muddle around and not go through a formal school system was completely out of the scope of consideration for them.
Yeah, right. And of course, there's like just this, and there's one thing that South Asia and Asia in general has usually always had over, the West to some extent, at least right currently. Maybe it was closer in some time ago, but the East has always maintained a fantastic cultural unity that the West today simply completely lacks for one reason or another. And because of this cultural unity and this sort of shared value system, they've been able to shift sort of entirely their cultural values and goals as a people as one. And it's almost like a hive mind to some extent, but it's given them absolutely great benefits. And so, this whole sort of individualist shtick only goes so far, especially when you look at the historical examples of where collectivism has just absolutely BTFO'd. the quote-unquote more individualistic countries.
Of course, the big problem with this, however, is that you can't necessarily come to them and say, well, we believe that our way of doing things is actually better, and so here's the way that you can change up everything to make it be kind of like what we were doing, because then people just get offended and start calling you a totalitarian authoritarian, which is really unfortunate. So, yes, I agree with what you just said, but I can't say it myself.
Yeah, no, I get that, because you still have the target on your back, unfortunately. But if that was the final point, was it not?
They were just about. So I'm also going to say I'm going to quote Emma Watson, which is a fun thing to do right now. Global Goodwill Ambassador of UN Women. She wrote, quote, "Universities are tiny utopias, a miniature model of how the whole society could look." And this is obviously, people will take a step back from that and they will usually begin complaining because it's Emma Watson. But what she was saying there was not much different from what R.A. Butler in the United Kingdom had said when he established the mandatory school system that exists in the United Kingdom anyway. That mandatory school was not only about learning, but rather it was for socialization.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't even necessarily disagree with Emma Watts' statement. Of course, I would have to say it would depend on which university you're talking about, obviously, or even what school you're talking about. Because personally, the experience I had in my Catholic high school was a great one, because for the most part, we were unified, not simply in sort of our academic achievement, because Catholic schools have a certain academic standard, but also in a certain spiritual unity, which obviously you won't get in any public school whatsoever. And that added a great deal to not only the socialization experience, but just the experience of growth as people in general. And so this idea that schools as a model of society is to be laughed at, I think, is dumb. I think it should be taken quite seriously.
Yeah,
Well, I think that
also since all students pass through these places as well, whatever it is that happens there is going to profoundly affect the person for the rest of their lives.
Well, I think that like you said, it depends on what school, but also depends on what kind of society that we're talking about. I certainly had a very positive experience in terms of socializing in my high school. In college, I've kind of experienced it's a much more atomizing experience to me. And I think this is more and more so the case in a lot of places across the U.S. at least. Um, Part of that is probably, I think, having public schools be more focused around like this commodification of education and the like it's all about the degree you have, what investments are made into the infrastructure and buildings of the school are made to make it appealing to people walking in a, like a showroom kind of way. They're not made to kind of increase the cohesion of the student body. They're the way classes are set up themselves a lot of times are not made so that you get to know people really well and form those kind of lasting bonds in the way you might have in high school, where you're generally in the same class with the same people. It's so it's if you were to model a society on the American public university or private university for that matter, probably even worse, it would be a dystopia, in my opinion.
Yeah,
And that's
I wouldn't
because we're
disagree
living in
with
a
that
dystopic
assessment.
society, but yeah.
Yeah, I think obviously there's, especially in the American education system, I'm not someone who, obviously pushes for a sort of Bernie Sanders-esque movement towards what he desires in the education system. But at the same time, we've fundamentally, America is a massive shopping mall, essentially, and this affects every aspect of our being, be it our education or be it, the way we go about trying to have religious experiences or experiences in socialization. Everything is very material based and very, very fake. And of course, that's going to affect the education system as well. So obviously, if we're going to try to model societies on universities, it'll probably have to be universities of a bygone era, or we're going to have to do a much better job at remodeling the current.
Or you step back by one step and say, instead of universities, because I think what everyone really was thinking was, you're thinking secondary school, aren't you? Or what you guys call high school.
Yeah, pretty much, more so
Yeah,
that.
you go back to that, because I think secretly everyone's thinking that that's where the utopia actually was.
Yeah, and that's probably more true because it's got that element of localization to it. Like there's a lot of psychological literature about how, the human brain can only maintain, so many contacts and of like, a somewhat reasonable degree of like relation. And meanwhile, we have all these different people on the internet who we have to keep track of now. And we have people in like hundreds of towns over, countries over, things like that we're trying to keep up with. And so what we have is this with globalization, we have this massive decrease in personalization that something like a high school has, because not only do you see these people every day for what is essentially since primary school as well, you also have them, within a 5-minute drive away. So you can go out and socialize with them outside of the school apparatus as well. And so I think, yeah, if we're going to base anything, it should be on the high school, secondary school
And it
sort
would
of
totally
localized model as opposed to this globalized current university model.
And it would also explain totally why. I mean, sometimes you can see the evidence of something through the culture before it is even actually vocalized. The fact that every time people do these nostalgia takes, for example, the nostalgia is always for the secondary school.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Well, I also think what's distinct about high school is it's a pretty unique environment for kids to be in, right? Because especially in America, environments tend to be either hyper sexualized or hyper non-sexualized. So you have a workplace, which you're expected to not make any sexual advances or talk to anybody, and then you have places like bars where hyper sociable, hyper sexual. High school was a weird middle ground where you're figuring stuff out, and you're still talking to people and you're interacting with them in, I guess, romantic fashion, but you have to rein it in a little bit, but not completely. So it had a unique environment that I don't think exists anywhere else.
The other factor which has to be mentioned, of course, is that everyone having to wear school uniforms has a psychological effect which is not replicated in university. In university, it's kind of like you're on your own, whereas in secondary school, you're sort of like, you're part of the group.
Yeah, well,
And
it should be
also the
noted
fact
that
that
American
teachers behave differently. Teachers behave differently in the secondary school context, obviously, than in university, because obviously in the secondary school context, teachers take an active interest in following you around and knowing what you are thinking.
Yeah, well, it should be noted that not all American secondary schools require uniforms. Like I had to wear a uniform, but like I said, I was in a Catholic high school. But I would go as far as to say that I think the socialization process and the learning ability of was better suited in a Catholic high school than American public high schools, which are very they're growing more and more commercialized and more uh, they're becoming less of that middle ground that Watts described for development, and they're becoming more politicized. And it's less of an experimental ground anymore, and a lot more rules are being imposed upon them that, while rules are present in a Catholic school, they're still fairly lax, even compared to public schools, which is this incredibly odd paradox. But that's a debate for us another time, perhaps.
One thing I would push back on that you were talking about is this what is the saving grace of high schools, and what we need to focus on for like improving, getting back to like some kind of more authentic human interaction. It's just localism, because I don't think you can turn the clock back on globalism, nor should you want to, because of the benefits that globally integrated supply chains have. But
Well, I didn't
it,
mean
it
more so in an economic sense. I meant just so from a
well, yeah,
personal
I
interaction
understand
standpoint.
that as well. But I also think that it is good. I think it's even more dangerous to say, oh, we're going to be hyper local as a community and just be completely global economic. That's going to create, I think, some dangerous contradictions. I think people we should have like this available, like a strong local tie, the ability to socialize very well with people close by, which we don't really have right now. But I also think that as like communication barriers break down, I've, for example, have made many great friends on the internet from very far away places, as well as like in my own university and people nearby. And the only real problem, the thing that lacks, of course, is like the physicality of it. And depending on the platform you're using, there can be certain restrictions on getting to know people that way. I think just chatting, like chat rooms and DMs are like the most like personalizing way to get to know someone here.
Mhm.
But the one thing it does lack is that personality. I think that's more of a failure of the transportation networks around us than a failure of like us not like us knowing too many people.
Okay, yeah. Well, I should say that I don't want people to just, go back to sort of a hyper localized era where, each town had its own time zone at some point, and the Pony Express was taking a couple days to get your mail from Virginia to like North Carolina or something like that. But I think it's more desirable to have this localized framework of the town or the community or something like that as a basis for personal interaction at the very least. And so that, as you're pushing your boundaries to meet more people in a greater national or international context, there's a home point of reference you can return to so that you don't lose yourself in this sort of globalized malaise. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, I think, to a certain extent. I think that the limit is kind of that how you define yourself and where you kind of like call home or whatever. I have a great sentimentality to the place where I was born in Texas, uh, and although I no longer live there, um, having that kind of sentimentality, I think, is independent of a certain um, like emphasis on local community. That because that will grow out organically, I think, no matter where you are or what is happening.
Yeah, I can see some of that always organically happening because there are a dip in this globalized era. We've found different ways to form different communities based on almost anything. I would just venture to say that certain things being of a certain level of syntheticness aren't going to be as cohesively binding for a group as things like place of birth, like the same town, or ethnic origin as well. Like I think those things are able to bind groups much more cohesively
Well, that's
than
the thing is I'm not as interested in that like as a group cohesion as a kind of like social control or what have you, or if you're thinking of it more from like an ethical like or humanist perspective, I'm not so interested in that. The extent I'm interested in it is the extent that I find absolution, I guess might be the word, or a sense of like, ah, yes, I know that's me. It's a reference point um, to less so because I don't know anyone in Texas anymore. All of my family is almost all of them have moved from there. But it's almost more of an aesthetic that I use to define myself.
okay.
Um,
I see the point you're making in that it's almost used as a universal sort of to convey individuality,
uh-huh.
and not so much just your actual home base point of origin. It's just another sort of universal descriptor for yourself.
Yeah.
I I understand that, and I think it's something like that is certainly worthwhile to have, but to the trouble with using things only aesthetically is because as they become very superficial, or things that are only used aesthetically have sort of that tendency to become just superficial. And when you define yourself in superficialities, I think you get some of the cultural hollowness that we're currently witnessing, especially in neoliberal America,
I
because
don't
you have a lot.
I personally don't see how you could find a culture that isn't hollow. Like there's always that kind of suspension of disbelief, that lingering doubt in the end. Like, well, what? Like you have to the extent that it is meaningful, it is only meaningful to the people. Like I think to the interactions between people that you care about personally. And I know that even Ray may disagree with me because I am, I guess, more of an exception to I guess a rule of socialization, and that I had a more an upbringing more um, it kind of transplanted out of like what might be my more traditional culture, I think it was still a good and healthy thing because it allows me to, I think, step aside from what might be conflicts between like what I view as superficial culture wars kind of shit. And I would appreciate it if more people took that view, because it is one, um, distracting on a personal level of understanding between people and of friendship between people, and also I think a centrifugal and disruptive force in modern society.
Okay, so again, I can understand where you're coming from in that sense, and it seems almost similar um, to what Zizek talks about in how he warns of the dangers of ideology and such.
Yes.
In that, yeah, no, I'm growing to be a very big fan of Zizek, and I'm liking a lot of his critiques a lot. But of
I
course,
just
I
posted
think
a tweet about a really great talk he did. You should check it out.
oh, definitely. I have a whole playlist. It's private because I don't like. I don't want to bother people on my Twitter with me adding videos to it. But it's a whole bunch of Zizek lectures and short little snippets that I have to watch. But one of the things I think that he's sort of a little bit naive about is this idea that as human beings, being free of ideology is something that we're even capable of. That we're able
I don't think
to.
Zizek says that that's something that we're capable. I think Zizek believes in like the Althusian interpretation of ideology, that it is a transhistorical force. It was, I think, which put Zizek on a different side from people like Marx and Hegel. Um,
Yeah,
so
I've been reading a good amount of Hegel lately, and he has very specific interpretations of Hegel to the point where sometimes he's wrong about Hegel, sometimes he has very good takes about Hegel, but there doesn't seem to be an in between. But one of the things I would say is that it's not being, even if we are enraptured by it, this idea that we can sort of almost take countenance of it as, partially objective viewers, like viewers of it from the outside, it seems to be some lacking to me because we're never free of it. Like, as to use a Hegelian context, what is concrete isn't that which is sort of individual or that one focus point that we reference. It is that which becomes universal, which all people are able to understand and communicate. And so if you're only aesthetically referencing a culture and you're only making it a superficial point of yourself, so that when you're trying to have larger conversations you can kind of toss it away and try to get this view of this whole picture, you're essentially doing yourself a disservice because you're tossing aside a larger universality that people could use to more easily relate to you and could easily be translated into other contexts in some other situation. And so by doing, and I agree there's some element of hollowness and superficiality to all cultures, but I think this has more to do with, the current state of ideology than, those former cycles of it being inherently, faulty. It's very tough to kind of, again, and sort of interpret the dialectic in which way it's flowing.
well, I would say that, like, once again, push back on the idea that Zizek thinks that ideology is something that we can overcome by being objective or empirical or whatever. Like, the opening line of Hurwitz's Guide to Ideology is, I am already eating from the trash can all
Yeah.
the time. The name of this trash can is ideology.
Yeah,
Um,
he's hopping out of the dumpster, right?
yeah, and I think that returning to culture and that kind of stuff, I don't see that. Like, I can understand, like, oh, I can make a connection with this person via culture or what have you, but I also believe that even with escaping that, not being able to get in touch with that, I can still come to know them as a person. Like, two people from, like, not people who do not share culture still become friends all the time, and that is really what I'd be looking for if I'm approaching someone. Is that kind of like it, the one aspect that I am truly like, oh, I am ashamed, is language. and that is like I am ashamed that I cannot am not good at learning languages, which I think is
Mhm.
the true kind of if only I could. This is the true barrier between becoming friends with people, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
it's another universal which we have yet to master, sort of.
Sure.
But I don't think you can get around the framework that you understand the world in, or your ideology. It's like trying to bite your own teeth, right? You can't idealize yourself out of ideology.
Well, I'm not saying you can. I don't think you can. I think that the best you can do is, like Zizek does, you can critique ideology. The best you can do is, and then kind of um, figure what kind of trends, um, like the difficult thing to do, and it's actually, but I think it is possible, is to figure out what material trends a certain ideology represent. And it's not going to be a constant thing. It requires close analysis and what have you. But generally, they do represent some kind of class interest or some other kind of interest, and you have to and you can kind of identify, well, is this in my interest? You can't, like, it's always going to be ideological, no matter which way you frame it. But there is a certain aspect of like it is the ideological aspect is still like a part of me, and that kind of self-interest or what have you. The point is to make sure that it doesn't dominate you entirely.
Yeah, I can understand that. You don't want to be overridden with ideology at any one point, even if you endorse that certain ideology. And
Yeah.
I get that. I think it's worthwhile to keep that in mind. You don't want to become possessed solely by one thing, or else really you lose the distinction between yourself and what your cause is. But at the same time, I would say that it's dangerous to throw out too many absolutes and too many conceptions that make you as a person a whole, because when we start to try to do this, in the name of, not trying to become overridden by a single one, we end out tossing too much of the baby with the bathwater. So it's, like with all things, it becomes a delicate balance. And I think, keeping a localized culture as a framework, and while still trying to, entertain the global stage on which we're now forced to live, is, I think it's sort of that reasonable middle ground, personally, anyway.
But it's like I don't know. Can we do that? Because we didn't really evolve to perceive the world in terms of this many people, or communities in terms of this many people, right? So, for example, like 6 months ago, when I was doing Westward Thought with Jay, we had John Francois Gariepi on, and we talked about that. And he had a theory that he thinks that the problem with nations is that people and democracies in general is that he doesn't think people properly evolved to be able to conceive of themselves in big enough numbers. Do we take in 50,000 refugees or 200,000 refugees, right? Numerically, there's a difference there. But to the average person, I don't think it feels like there's a huge difference. Once you pass a certain point, you can't really, I guess, get a feel for what that means. It becomes meaningless on a large scale like that. So can we
Right.
work from a
Well, it
framework
has
of
ideological
localizations?
meaning, but I think that we as like social beings do have like a set of tricks, I think, to deal with all these, like the fact that it becomes meaningless. I think it goes to credit like our ability to function in large, even industrial societies. It allows us to um, interact with a large amount of people and still kind of carry on with a focus around ourselves and whatever um, electrons to our uh, like nucleus that we affiliate with. It I don't think like humans are remarkably well adaptive. Our big advantage, I think, is being able to adapt without waiting for evolution to necessarily catch up through like passing information through solely genetics. We have memory, we have a storytelling, and passing information through multiple avenues.
I get what you're saying there, but I think a lot of how people organize themselves socially, to a point, is just such a primal and ancient method that we've evolved to have. So it's kind of difficult. Like, can we talk outside that framework? Can we expand it, or we're limited in some sense?
Well,
So I would advocate for more localization. I don't think we should be making a lot of these big picture decisions with a small group of people or with people voting, because people just, I don't think they can grasp the concept.
Well, it's really like, that's not the fact that there are always a small number of people ultimately making decisions, regardless of, well, there's always, like the undercurrents of mass ideology, movements, pressure, what have you. Those kind of dynamics don't really change no matter what society you're in, I think. Except except to the extent of, like class warfare, masses versus whatever.
I know there are always going to be a small group of people.
The point that I wanted to get to was that, like, Zizek has talked about this. The big, I think, changes aren't so much the numbers. Like, that's always been there since, like, the birth of industrial society. What is really changing now is, like, the digitalization, the change of, like, the ability to manipulate, like, genetics, the ability to, like, we're seeing, like, the ability to the breakdown of barriers between like the realm of, like, Zizek talks about as, like, consciousness of, like, what's separating me from you, and the way it's this medium through we communicate. More and more, like, the goal of our communications technology has been to further shrink and break down those barriers, and what, like, is to become of us as we like, what does it change to be human as we change our, like, position with other people around us, and being able to communicate with them in probably new ways. I gotta change my laundry. I'll be right back.
Okay, that's good exit. I think
You can go ahead and respond real quick, and then I think we might just move on after this, because me and Ray.
Sorry.
No worries. I think because me and Ray have an issue of contention that we still haven't even gotten to yet.
That's fine. Yeah, I think we're still going to be inevitably limited by, Dunbar's number. You can only keep in contact with so many people, and having it spread out so thin over a vast country is, I think, overall more harmful. So I would advocate for a spin-off of the ideology of federalism, of local communities, and a decentralized system that just kind of work things out together, instead of having, like, this centralized voting for everybody getting together and voting for these big policy issues, or having these politicians vote policy issues. I think it's more harmful.
No, I can. I think that's one of the areas where Zizek does go a little off board, in that he talks about, massive issues along the lines of ecological disasters and things on the scale of, like, Fukushima and the Indonesian tsunami, and he talks about how we need these massive structures in order to deal with the costs. But at the same time, there were disasters that affected multiple nations of, the medieval world, and, like, say, the Holy Roman Empire, but each duchy was able to handle it in its own way. And, the German Confederation and its predecessor, the Holy Roman Empire, were able to sustain themselves for, a workable period of time, even if there was some conflict within it. It's nothing, it's certainly nothing on the scale of which we'd have today. And so I don't think it's, as huge of a deal as Zizek makes it out to be. But I think we'll end that right there, because I think, Ray, you and I have to pick up a small conversation that we started literally right at the end of our last stream.
Yes, that is true. I know where you're going with that, but should we actually do the other thing that you had on the list first before we do that? Because it seems that one of these things segues seamlessly to the other. If we're talking about society, and then you're about to ask me, after you ask me this other thing, you're about to ask me about the issue of Russian interference in American political life.
Oh, you want to get into that? Oh, okay,
Yeah,
sure. I thought
well,
you were.
only briefly, but it seems to exploit the same thing that what's his name, Ghost there was talking about in terms of the Dunbar's number, right?
Right.
A
Yeah.
lot of Russian propaganda is essentially exploiting that fact, because if the people don't necessarily know what's going on at all times, then you can essentially get in there and do quite a lot of very, very horrible things. So, for example, Russian propaganda bubble. I'm just going to go through it quickly, although we all know this anyway. But you have to say it because you're on a live stream, so you have to say it anyway. Russian propaganda model is high volume, multi channel, disseminates messages, no regard for the truth, apparently. It's rapid, continuous, repetitive, and inconsistent. And you would think normally that this is a bad way to run an information operation, but if you look at it from a psychological perspective, this stuff works because it's exploiting um, things which are, I guess you could say, much earlier on in human evolutionary history. So it's exploiting the disparity between earlier evolutionary adaptations and the fact that we're living in a gigantic democracy thing, right? One of the things that makes this fire hose of falsehood, as they've been calling it, very effective, it also makes it very difficult to counter, because in order to counter it, you have to actually behave just as they are behaving. So you can't do your usual counter prop approach. You can't come in and say, okay, here's a fire hose of nonsense, and we're going to like select some things out of it, and then we're going to like criticize each one of those things, and then show using graphs and figures and quotations how this thing is actually not true. That doesn't work, because by the time you've actually taken these things and you've isolated them, they've moved on to something else and they're hosing them down with something new.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, I don't
And so
think the idea of this happening is in question. I think the larger effect has been. I think the larger question is to what extent, specifically, it's actually affected the American populace, because the America in particular has been bombarded by international propaganda since almost essentially its conception. And so this
of
idea
course.
that Russian propaganda is unique is something that I try to shift out, because I'm trying to determine the exact effect of it and why exactly it's worth all this unique attention, per se.
Oh, it's because of the profound effect they've been able to achieve, because they learned how to behave this way just in time to take advantage of social media. Now, you'd think that they would have this kind of effect during the time when the USSR was in existence, which I guess they did because they had a very sophisticated way of doing things then as well. But I think now they've sort of, they've done something which is very different from what they had done before, because in their previous iteration, in the previous state they operated, there was at least some concern for sort of getting your facts done correctly. So it was kind of propaganda in the more formal sense. Now it's kind of like they'll just do whatever they want. So
Well, what is
I'll give an example. They will sometimes recycle their disinformation. So, for example, sometimes they'll say one thing and then they'll drop it to the floor, and then they'll not touch it for about 5 months, and then they'll come back and they'll do it again, which is something they weren't doing previously. Let me give you
what
some
is an
examples
example
of
of
this.
them doing something
Okay.
like that? Like, what
Okay.
specific story have they done that with?
Okay, I can give you some examples of this. I don't know if you'll remember all of these. One of them, Polish President Andrzej Duda insisting that Ukraine return former Polish territory. Like, that was a false story which they propagated several times at different times.
Mhm.
Another one was that Islamic State fighters are joining pro-Ukrainian forces. That was brought up probably about 7 times, and each time it was obviously false. They were just every time they would get debunked on it, they would like put it away and then bring it out again a couple months later. And then there was another one, that there is a Western-backed coup happening in Kiev, which was not actually true, but they repeatedly brought that one back as well.
Sure.
There are other ones. There are some ones involving Hillary Rodham Clinton as well.
Well, it's
What was
interesting that you actually mentioned this stories like, ISIS fighters joining Kiev, or like the Western Baku and things like that. Because when I hear stories like that, one of the things that immediately pops into my mind is examples of Western media outlets doing much the same thing, in the form of, like, the last hospital in X Syrian city has just been bombed. Oh, like the last hospital in Aleppo. Like, I think the
Yeah,
last
yes,
hospital in Aleppo has been bombed like
I'll
over
actually
like
give
a
you
hundred
that one.
times or something.
Yeah,
It's getting
I'll give you that
ridiculous.
one, because someone must have decided they were going to also try a fire hose technique there, because that one became very obvious. Because I was thinking, how many times can the last hospital in Aleppo be destroyed? That became like a meme almost among
Oh
among all
yeah.
kinds of analysts. Where you'd have, I mean, I'm talking even Western analysts started making jokes about this at one point, where it was just kind of like, that last hospital in Aleppo, it's always out there somewhere.
Yeah, so it's like, now another thing, like, I don't deny, like this. I'm sure there are other tactics that you'll mention about this, but my question is specifically like, sure, Russia is doing this and it's having effect on somewhat of a global scale, more so in Europe and the US. But what has its effect been in the US exactly? Because when I see the DNC continue to go on about it, like obviously the DNC is like the worst of the worst, and they'll make the worst possible case at all times, and they shouldn't be taken at face value. But like, what is like the grain of truth in what they're saying about why we should take this Russia propaganda seriously, at least in a perspective of, you know, the average United States citizen?
Okay. A good example of why it's really important is this woman they've arrested just now, Maria Butina, who was working with what's his name, Valentin Konstantinev. I don't know if I've actually pronounced his name correctly, and another individual. She was being commanded, or I should say, managed by Alexander Torshin. The fact that she was able to get in, and despite the fact that she had been physically present and photographed inside eastern Ukraine with opposition forces in that location, and that she had been connected to these individuals who were definitely Russian intelligence assets, the fact that she was able to just meander her way into the United States, become part of the National Rifle Association, and then, I mean, I'm not saying the National Rifle Association is like bad on its own or anything like that. So obviously the Democrats may have a slightly different view on this, but I'm saying that the fact that they let her in and then proceeded to allow her to just walk around from senator to senator and from figure to figure, just having conversations with these people, and then she was apparently writing back to her commanders in Russia about how gullible the people were. I mean, this is one of those things where in order for something like that to happen, you have to have laid the ground first with your propaganda operation so that the persons will be open to these kind of people. So that's why it's extremely important, because the consequences can be severe. I mean, the most severe consequence out of all of this is that now you have a president of the United States which is actually fulfilling the desires of Russian commanders, which is obviously bad.
Well, a lot of this, and I've seen this in to the extent that I've been involved in like organized politics on the party level and other stuff like that. It's you know, and this is true both for like the social media operations and for like the IRL operations, is that the like ability to capitalize on tripping someone's ego is just and maybe it's like worse in America. I don't know how it is other places, but that's just, you can, if you take advantage of that, and you're good at taking advantage of it, you can go so far. Um, the the people who are involved in high level activist circles, conservatives, I'm sure especially, just love like that kind of attention. I'm sure that she would give them and that kind of stuff. In terms of
Yes, I actually agree with you on that. There is the ego factor.
yeah, and I think it applies as well to the social media operations because Russia came in. They came in to the scene on the internet where everybody was desperate to play this role of like, oh, info, like manipulation. We gotta like, whether it's like anonymous
Oh
4chan.
yeah, it's that whole unmasking the truth thing that
Yeah,
was going
yeah,
on, where
and
everyone else
especially
would be
like
that person
Infowars.
who's like a V for Vendetta or something. Yes,
Mhm.
I alone somehow know the truth. That
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thing,
yeah.
right?
Like Infowars was the epitome of that. They just like that is literally their brand. And what like it to a certain extent I think it invites that kind of intelligence operations because you have a whole bunch of people here who are like desperate to do something like that.
Indeed, they're desperate to do something, and they're desperate to be given information that they can talk about. And so, of course, the first thing you do is you just turn them into a grey propaganda source instantly by just shoving lots of information in their direction until they start to pick up on it, which is precisely what the Russians did.
Okay, I can I can understand that, and I can give that credence where it's at. Now,
There's another aspect of it as well that I should just quickly do before you say what you're about to say, which is basically
sure.
6 bullet points. It is six, right? Hopefully it'll be six. Well, I guess at the end we'll find out whether it's six. But um, another, I mentioned psychology earlier on, so I should also just quickly run through the psychological cues that are used. Obviously, the first one is the one that Enver just mentioned, which is basically appealing to the person's ego. Like, you're a fantastic person, you're a seeker of the truth, so here's a bunch of documents which are unverified. The second one, repeated exposure to a statement has been shown to increase its acceptance as true. So, you come out there and you just continue to repeat the same thing over and over again, and people might begin to believe it's true. Illusory truth effect is another one, where people believe that a statement is actually more truthful, valid, or believable if they've encountered those statements previously than when they are new statements. So if you say something to someone like about 5 months ago or something, and then you repeat it 3 months ago, and then you wait about a year and you bring it back again, the person will remember that they heard it perhaps a long time ago, an unspecified number of months ago, which will then make them subjectively believe that it was more truthful than it actually is. There's another one, which is people who are only slightly interested in a topic. And these are kind of like, your sort of person who's out there in Alabama somewhere. Sorry for having to choose a random state, and it happens to be Alabama, but there it is. Someone who's out there in Alabama, perhaps quite isolated from the sort of, the globalizing world around them. They're not necessarily too interested in, say, I don't know, we just choose a random topic. Not necessarily too interested in how the Trans-Pacific Partnership works, for example, but
Sure.
if you come to them and you continually repeat a lie to them about how this thing works, then they become familiar with this lie, and so they're more likely to accept the familiarity brought about by that than information from someone who is coming to correct them later. So, and that's called the frequency heuristic. In other words, they're favoring information which they have heard more frequently. If they don't know anything about the topic, they will favor the thing which they've heard repeated more times than the thing that they've heard less times. Another one, preposterous stories and urban legends. Sometimes if you hook something onto the back of a preposterous urban legend through a comparison, right, then people will hook onto it more because now you've associated it with something which they already believe. It doesn't even have to be rational. So sometimes Russia will do that as well, or they'll learn about the kind of idioms and specific peculiarities of speech which Americans engage in, which perhaps other actors don't understand, and then they'll try to kind of assimilate themselves to that. So I'll give a quick example of this. When Americans are on social media, they are almost immediately aware of when they are talking to someone who is not from the United States because they don't use the same idioms, they don't use the same way of writing, right? So I'm pretty sure that, like, for instance, when people interact with me on Twitter, even if you were to blank out my name and profile photo, they would be fully aware that they're not talking to an American anyway, because I just don't write the way they do and I don't use the same expressions that they do. Whereas what Russians will try to do is they'll try to become one of these people. They will not approach as a foreigner. Unless of course they're trying to go for the ego thing, which is that suspicious looking Russian person is interested in you, in which case then that's slightly different. Another one is that the familiarity, again, because the fire hose is really important. With familiarity, another thing that's learned in terms of psychology is that they process it less carefully. So you can actually use a very weak argument, but if you repeat it multiple times, people will begin to accept it because they're actually not processing it anymore after a certain point. Particularly if you've hooked it to something that they're already very emotive about. So, example, Trans-Pacific Partnership again, because I keep choosing this because I've already mentioned it before. I came across a guy who insisted to me that China was part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is untrue.
Yeah, no, that's
and he insisted this at least 7 times. I had to argue. Yeah, and so I had to argue to him and basically prove to him repeatedly that China is not part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And even then, he was never really sure as to whether I was telling him what was true. Now, how could he have come to be in that situation? I think it's possibly because the Trump people had kept repeating the issue of China this, China that, and China the other, and then on the other hand, they would quickly start talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and this caused him in his mind to associate these two things as though they are one and the same. Like, what's the difference between, for him, there was no functional difference between a trade deal which was primarily led by Japanese efforts and a non-existing trade deal that was never even happening, that was supposedly led by Chinese efforts, but wasn't happening, I should emphasize. So it was very mysterious. And it was then that I thought, this is another instance of that kind of thing occurring. And so the agility that comes from them being first as well is another thing that Russia has exploited, because usually when an issue breaks, the first thing that will happen is Russia will mobilize their kind of social media bots, if you want to call them that, and they will go out there and immediately begin talking about it. They'll probably create a hashtag and so on, and then you have to deal with it.
Well, it is. I think they do have usually rely on some kind of grain of truth in a lot of the myths and rumors that they'll start. The thing about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China is involved in making another trade pact right now that's, I think, going to be
RCEP, which is going to
which includes a lot of
other.
Trans-Pacific Partnership countries.
Yes, and so they're overlapping.
Exactly, but
they never asked the United States to join that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the other things worth mentioning is that, being that it's so quickly to be conflated in people's minds, it's something where there's a lot of retconning involved in the process as well, where, you could immediately say something that's wrong, and if it might or might not be supported at first, and people can go back and sort of adjust their statement or appear to clarify what they were originally saying and make it so that it seems more plausible based on new evidence that's been presented, or if they have new evidence that they kind of bend to fit
They'll
their
adapt
original
on the fly
narrative.
to the criticism.
Yeah, kind of.
The other one they'll sometimes also do is something that I've seen people describe as sort of the superiority syndrome, which is where you come across a particular Trump supporter and you'll try to basically tell them that the thing that they've said is actually factually incorrect, aside from what anyone feels about that thing. And they'll immediately step onto a high horse and begin acting as though they alone have special access to information that no one else has possession of.
Mm-hmm. Well,
The very strange thing is I do not know where that one comes from, because obviously that's not on the list, but I've encountered that several times.
yeah, I think it comes from the fact that people nowadays don't really trust any particular source of information based on where they're getting it from. And so when people tend to not trust any authority whatsoever, rightly or wrongly so, they feel like, the information that they've done some amount of research on from X number of sources, because they're the ones who have personally looked into it, makes them an authority on it. And I think that's not something, it's something people choose to focus on in Trump supporters, I believe, because Trump supporters are the sort of focus of everybody's ire at this point in time. But it's really something you
True,
need to
other
just,
people may
it's
be doing
something,
it too.
yeah, it's something I'd say that's common to almost the whole of humanity. Like a lot of the things you're pointing out, while they are being, utilized by the Russians, they're also things that are just, common psychological trends used by nations on other nations and used by nations on their own populace for,
Yeah.
all of recorded history. So, well, of course, you
Although I
want
think
to
NATO
defend.
countries have been more reluctant to use these kind of tools until recently, against on their own people, of course. And the reason for this is because there's always been this jitteriness among I guess you could say NATO countries. There's always been this jitteriness among NATO countries about these kind of tactics, because of the fact that if you get caught doing it, then your trust is destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Well, Russia is already a pretty low trust society, so
Exactly. In which case
there's only
they
so
don't
much
care.
more they can lose.
Well, this is why
Exactly.
you have the five eyes, and then you get around stuff like that you just ask your partner to take care of it on yourself.
This is what I've been on that note. This is what I've been wondering, because if the United States is willing, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this later, but I mean, if the populations of the United States are willing to essentially stand there and just let Russia rickroll them for like 2 years straight now, why hasn't everyone else decided to also get in on this game yet? Like, for example, you could have the United Kingdom just do unto them what has already been done unto them by Russia, and perhaps
Well,
take
I
the thing
think
back.
I think there's an answer to this, and it sort of leads into my next point of questioning, is that I think some of what is what is desired by Russia in terms of foreign policy goals is also organically desired by a large portion of the American base, and some of that being, better relationships with Russia so that we're at peace with a nuclear power, better options in the Middle East if we're cooperating with this other superpower that already has its hands in the area. And I think some of it isn't purely, Russian botting. I think a lot of it is organic support for these issues that we just happen to align with Russia on. And that kind of
I'll
leads
have
me
to
to
meet you
ask.
on that one, because yes, there is something real that Russia had to hook into in order to get to that, and I'm thinking that nations in Western Europe hypothetically could attempt the same kind of operations, wouldn't have the same things that they could hook into. For example, let's say that you're playing as the Netherlands or something, right? And you're trying to engage in some kind of propaganda operation in the US. If you're the Netherlands, you can't come into the US and be like, okay, I'm going to engage in some racist, sexist propaganda, which is going to somehow benefit the Netherlands. There's very little that they would be able to do that would be within the bounds of reason for them. Whereas
Sure.
for Russia, they can just come in there and be like, well, we heard that you don't like Chinese people or something like this, and just start from there.
Yeah, well, that's one thing. Russia certainly has a lot more to work on as another major superpower and sort of like the tripartite base of power that we're currently viewing in global geopolitics and that sort of thing. But I think another thing is, and this is sort of my question, I think a lot of what the American base desires and a lot of what Russian bots happen to be pushing, being that it is so similar, almost to the point where where people are genuinely confused as to what is a quote unquote Russia bot and what is some
that
sort of
drinking
organic
game.
supporter
The
of
drinking
Trump.
game. Boss
Yeah,
or actual Trump supporter.
yeah, well, that's the thing. If this is something organically desired by a legitimate portion of the American voting base, and Russia just happens to be on board with it, is it necessarily a bad thing that we're gaining outside support for a belief that, homegrown Americans also happen to hold?
Well, I think that you're kind of overstating the impact of geopolitics on this kind of decision making, whereas a lot of it also comes from the fact that Russia is viewed as, I think, the big reactionary power in the world today, almost in a way that was kind of viewed in the early 1900s when like the Second International was all like, oh no, we have to go to war now because Russia is the great reactionary power in the world, and it's kind of the same sentiment,
Yes,
except
they're
now
back
it's
to yeah.
reactionaries agreeing that, oh great, it's Russia. They're the home of Christian orthodoxy and the tough on gays and stuff like that. They're going to help us out.
Yeah,
Okay, but
actually,
I
there does
lost
seem to be
I lost
some
your
of that.
point a little bit in there. What exactly did that have to do with, like, how much of it is homegrown in
Well,
America?
it's I think it's less as like homegrown agreeing with Russia's geopolitics and them agreeing with Russia on more like cultural, social kind of issues and looking for support on that. And like, oh, now gay marriage is legal. Now, like it looked like in like 2012 or something, the liberals won the cultural war.
Yes, actually, I'll agree with you on that, and it's because I think the Russians have made a conscious effort on that front as well. For example, when they started giving money to various conservative civic groups in the U.S., such as like Family Research Council and stuff like this, I think that is quite so. Because I've come across some people who, when you ask them questions about geopolitics, they have no idea what's going on. But when you ask them things like what are their social issues, then they can actually tell you all the social issues they agree with Russians, quote unquote, on.
As a
Okay.
side note, this is one of the reasons why I say that cultural wars is a much more disintegrating force in society and politics than a lack of like local citizenship. But continue.
No,
No, no, no. I fully agree as well. I mean, we even saw this in the contest with academic Asian, for example.
Hmm.
When he starts doing some of the things that he does, and you think, "Oh, this looks very, sort of Russified," it's usually the culture warrior stuff.
Oh yeah, of course.
yeah, okay. So I understand, like, the general point here that there's this conflation between cultural values and similar geopolitical goals. But at the same time, it can't be discounted that there are those who understand sort of the nuances of the geopolitical machinations that are happening in the Middle East, in the war with ISIL and what's happening with Assad and things like that. And,
Yes.
obviously, this is a much
They
more
aren't the majority of
intellectually
the GOP base, though.
yeah, no, that's not the majority of the GOP base, obviously. I'm not claiming it is. But,
And
I mean,
occasionally, you do come across some people who are seeing the Northeast Asia perspective as well. For example, I saw what's his name? It's a very popular Twitter user. I think his name is Texit something or the other. Forgotten his name now,
I
but
think I've heard something about him,
Yeah.
yeah,
yeah.
and he was quoting from the American Conservative, as in the online website, and they had up an article explaining why the United, from their perspective, of course, why the United States ought to actually side with Russia in the pivot space in order to prevent rising factory Asia from gaining, I guess you could say, territorial control of trade routes. Which is a very strange way of looking at the world, given that you cultivated this entire China relationship from 1960 whatever it was, sorry, 1972 going forward, only
Yeah,
for
with
them to
Nixon.
now, decide, okay, what we're going to do is reverse Nixon because you've become too intelligent and too powerful.
Yeah, no, I think that's
I mean, when they're just openly admitting to that, it's kind of like, how do you get into a debate with them and explain to them that they shouldn't behave this way? Because it means that they're already determined to have that war.
yeah, it's become the again, like Enver said, this isn't something that the average American voter is concerned on because, but then again, I'd argue it's something that the average voter in general in any country isn't concerned on because I don't think, the average person is quite honestly learned enough to understand all the complex nuances that go into this. And this isn't a knock on the average person. This is like fucking complex stuff that you actually have to do a fair amount of research into in order to understand. But at the same time, you know, this is sort of the folly of democracy and trying to get, the quote unquote masses to, uh, choose the right person in order to actually solve these problems in the first place. But
Also,
sort of getting
also another thing that I should add just quickly before you go on with that is it shows also how shallow the penetration of the values that they had professed just a decade ago to adhere to actually were. Because if you'll go back to many of these people just a decade ago, they'll be telling you that free trade is awesome, okay? And they'll be telling you that you don't cooperate with powers in which the government is primarily a rent seeker and not a producer of goods. And they'll be telling you all about democracy and so on and so forth. But then if you fast forward 10 years into now, suddenly you've got these guys totally okay with supporting Russia, which is a reactionary power, which is entirely rent-seeking, does not produce anything because you've never seen a Russian product on your shelves that's not a gun or a form of alcoholic drink, as we know. And I don't say that flippantly. I mean, if you actually try to look for it, you can't find them. There are no Russian televisions. There are no Russian mobile phones.
I don't think it speaks to a dishonesty necessarily within a voting base in America, although I can understand how you'd see it like that. I think it speaks to the fact that most Americans aren't actually aware of the things that they value. Like they'll sort of give lip service to this idea of, American democracy and free trade and capitalism and, America and all that. But deep down, there's really sort of this spiritual longing for, that cohesive sort of white suburb that there once was, and this sort of ethnically and culturally unified nation in the form of white Protestant Christianity and things like that. And being that their goals to achieve that have changed, they've decided to back a different pony instead of the things they previously were. So I don't think it's their values that have changed. I think it's their understanding
of tactics they want to use. Yes, this is something I was going to say as well, yes, because I was getting the impression of that as well, because back when they were supporting the free trade stuff, I always had this sneaking suspicion the reason they supported these policies was because they supposed that these things would actually result in everyone else being subjugated somehow. For instance, when they supported NAFTA, I always had I got the impression that they thought that supporting NAFTA would mean that Mexico would never be co-equal with them. And then they stopped supporting NAFTA once they realized that actually that's precisely what it was creating.
I think it's a less of an oppression game and more of an idea of just like, all right, we'll just keep to us and all of you just get the fuck out. Like, I don't think it's a power game of us over them. It's more of just like us to ourselves and them wherever the fuck they are, sort of thing.
I would kind of flip all this on its head for a moment. One, on the grounds that the Republican Party isn't like a coherent person that has like a linear pathology about all these things.
True.
The Republican Party is like a coalition of a bunch of different things. Throughout all this, like you see that the business part of the coalition is dominant when it's talking about the free trade in the past like 10 years ago and so on, all these other things. And not just dominant in a way that, it controls policy. It was dominant in an ideological way that was able to convince all the other kind of parts of the coalition that this was in fact the case.
Oh, actually, good point. No, you're right.
And Richard Wolff, I think, does a fantastic job of breaking these things down. What kind of happened is that people, I think, one, felt more like helpless in the political system, didn't feel that their voices were being heard and what have you. They also probably felt that they were at least a bit bamboozled by like these promises that didn't all go through, that probably could have never begun through because they're like fantastical to begin with.
Yes, overstating the gains that could have been made, and also the fact that they combine these things with like no social policies whatsoever. So I mean, they shouldn't necessarily be surprised they end up with a disgruntled base if they do all of these things which they said they were going to do, but then at the same time, they then turn around and say, okay, what we're also going to do is we're just going to completely destroy all social services whenever we encounter them.
Mm-hmm.
That's creating the seeds for dissatisfaction there. The other thing which I think the Republican Party lacked, which the Democrats actually did have, is the Democrats have the superdelegate system, which means that they were capable of blocking out tendencies and trends that they didn't want manifest, kind of like how the British Parliament system does the same thing, where if you had some kind of insurgent character, the parties can stop them by simply just not nominating that person. Whereas in the case of the Republican Party, I mean, if you have a sudden bout of craziness, then you're going to have that person win the primaries.
Yeah, well, I think the Republican Party is still very much stuck on a commitment to sort of the democratic ideal still. But on top of that, at this stage, I don't necessarily think that a superdelegate system to try to block crazy trends is necessarily a good thing, because crazy in the DNC establishment is probably somebody like that Hispanic woman who just took a seat in Queens, or is going to when the actual elections come up, because New York always goes blue.
Ocasio-Cortez?
Yeah, her. Like, to like the DNC establishment, that's crazy. Because, you know, both the DNC and RNC establishments are just left-right variants of neoliberalism. And so when you have an establishment that's trying to block quote unquote crazy, you just get different variations of neoliberalism. And so I'm almost sort of happy that the RNC doesn't have that mechanism for blocking crazy trends, because what's crazy to the establishment right now is this sort of reactionary politics, which I'm actually happy is going through.
No, I mean, from the perspective of the right, which obviously it would be difficult for me to describe the perspective of the right, but I mean, if I were to pretend to be on their side for a second, if I were them, I would not have wanted that to happen, because that's essentially a reputational boat anchor that has been tied around their foot now. Because
Right.
now, from now going forward, everyone's always going to remember the weird orange guy who came and did stuff.
Hey, compare that to Ocasio-Cortez, for example. She is rhetorically doing very well. She's very well spoken. She's I think that it's fair to
Yes.
say that she's a net bonus for the Democratic Party.
Yes,
She's
and
doing
so-
some.
Yes and
Yeah.
no.
And that is why I believe in the case of the Democratic Party here, it's not that she was an insurgent and was capable of overcoming the barriers that the Democratic Party placed in her way, but rather the Democratic Party superiors, after she won against Crowley, chose deliberately to roll over and allow her to advance.
Yeah, no, they are sort of making that decision, post hoc, but at the same time, they know that an Ocasio-Cortez is going to drive away absolutely huge swaths of the white voting base, which they've tried to
I
cultivate
disagree with
really
that completely.
hard.
I disagree with that completely, because if you look, she just went. She and Bernie Sanders did a rally in Kansas, Wichita, Kansas, of all places. Massive, had to move a venue into a bigger place. I think that there is that she and Bernie Sanders, and Zizek points to this as well, of Sanders in particular, that he was one of the few people on the left who was able to take those people, those white working class, and divert them away from people like Trump. And I think Ocasio-Cortez can work in a similar way, and possibly even more effectively if she's capable of keeping the more diverse base and white working class people at the same time.
Yes, I saw something similar about this as well. There was a woman I saw writing an article who's, unfortunately, I've forgotten the name and the link, but she had written, the title was something like "Stop saying that white people won't vote for the far left" or something like that. It was some kind of title that was approximate to that. And when you read it, there was this detailed description she gave of her own community and how what's happening is much like what seems to happen in the Islamic community in Britain, for example, which is that in these communities of white people in the US, you seem to have very, very loud males at the kind of like the top who kind of make everything look like it's trending very, very far to the right. But then if you put your shovel in, you get beneath the surface, you kind of find that like white women don't seem to agree with what white men are saying on these things. And then there's like a significant age stratification as well, where when you go down younger, you're getting more to the center and more to the left, but the further up, when you're talking about more older people, for example, then you're moving to the right there. So once you start disambiguating it, you can't necessarily say that it's like all white people, even though it can be rhetorically rhetorically useful sometimes to say it's all white people.
Well, I
Of
think
course,
that's
in reality, it isn't.
yeah. Well, I think that's the thing. Like the key thing I think you mentioned there is stratification by age, and I'd tell you that the quote unquote white working class that people like Sanders and Cortez have been able to uh, court an audience with is more of it's a couple people. It's holdover, baby boomers that were kind of, hippie-ish and left-wing in their youth, and they never really grew out of it. It's current millennials who are really into the free college thing because they don't want student debt anymore. And it's some of Gen X that was sort of just a reaction against Reagan. So it's sort of a coalition of those three age groups that are into Sanders and the Cortez kind of scene. But I think beyond that, I do think you lose most of the white working class, especially when you look at voting trends by demographics. Like if you look at white people as a block and you were to break down the electoral college map, Trump would have gotten something over, I think, 400 votes in the electoral college just on if only white people had been voting. And as you pointed out, Ray, obviously it does shift between white women and white men, as white women tend to lean just a little bit more leftward than white men, but it wasn't even significant enough amongst white women to have given Hillary the win. They too would have voted overwhelmingly for Trump again. It would have been another pretty massive blowout. And so I do think while there's certainly a portion of the white working class that they've managed to court, it's certainly not representative of white people as a whole. And I think larger trends that Pew and others have been able to identify sort of point this out quite clearly.
I think I think it
No, go
matters
first.
in that terms of that demographic, in terms of voting blocks, if you can get a significant portion while holding on to a largely diverse colored base, that's an election winner in the United
Yeah,
States.
that's true. That's a fair enough point. You don't need to win over the
Yeah, you don't
whole
need to have
white
the
working
whole of a
class.
particular thing. You can just have some of it. The other thing that's worth mentioning, obviously, although it's kind of like the elephant in the room, which is that I'm pretty sure that Ocasio-Cortez will do very well among Hispanic voters.
Yeah, I mean, she's in. I grew up on Long Island, and so I know like the surrounding New York State, New Jersey, Connecticut tri-state area pretty well, and I know the area she's running in is heavily immigrant. It's like largely Puerto Rican, I believe, is the key demographic, and then you got your Guatemalans and your
Yeah.
Hondurans, and that largely Hispanic thing. So she's going to win down there, no
Yes.
matter what. I mean, even if
Also,
it wasn't there,
also
like
the
New
other
York
trend,
is just incredibly blue, so she's guaranteed to win one way or another. But I just
also
think
the other trend which is worth mentioning is that one of the fastest growing demographics in the US is also the Asian American demographic, and up until now it was kind of like a mixed bag because, well, maybe people know this already, but amongst the Democratic Party, obviously there was always a sort of democratic lean among Asian Americans, right? But there was also significant numbers of Republicans, so 40 something percent. So, part of the thing that the Republicans had that was a real problem, though, in terms of the Asian American community, is that Republicans never used to actually attend events because in order to get votes from an Asian community, you just kind of attend Asian events and at least like sit in a chair and look like you're somewhat interested and perhaps eat the food. Democrats would do this. Republicans would never do this, and so there was obviously a slow trickle where there was this lean toward the left that was happening for a long time. And when it came around to the 2016, or I should say 2015, during the primaries, I think most Asian voters who were aligned to the Republican Party wanted either Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush to become the nominee. As soon as the nominee turned out to be actually Donald Trump, that caused a massive sea change. And so now that we check back in 2018 and we look at the figures, there's apparently been a massive Asian American falling away from the GOP, and these people are re-registering themselves as Democrats instead. This is something which almost no one has talked about yet, but it's probably going to be significant once we get around to November 2018 and perhaps in 2020 as well.
I think a factor in all of this. I worked for a Democratic county committee at one point, and the head of the committee was an Asian immigrant woman, and she was a pretty effective administrator there. And I also worked with one of my uh, colleagues was this intern from South Korea, and what struck me, and like generally Democratic activist bases are much more diverse than the Republican ones. And I think that that's can actually be a factor when you when you're dealing with stuff like that, in that those people in the certain communities, like Asian communities, or even like people in immigrant communities who might tend toward to be conservative, will encounter like the most politically active ones will encounter a Republican Party that and it's especially its activist section that is usually very hostile to them, versus a much more welcoming environment in the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, that's the GOP outreach has always been abysmal when trying to court minorities of any type. I think,
And it's usually weird polemics that they'll come with as well. They'll start by, well, this is something that's obviously part of psychology as well. That if you're starting with a polemic and trying to get someone to your side, you should not start by describing all the ways in which people ought to actually hate you in the first place. But they'll usually come and say, well, our opponents say that we're, some kind of like demonic manifestation. But of course, as soon as you've actually done that and you've self-described it in this way, then they're already thinking about that before you've even begun.
yeah, that's a very good point as well. But I think uh, the big thing that GOP has done horribly is, on top of not being able to outreach properly, they're not doing outreach to the one base that they win consistently, which is white people. And at this point, it's still worth mentioning that white people do make up a majority of the United States. And it's worth mentioning that if you're not catering to the at least what you know to be a strong majority, then you always risk losing. And I think that was my initial point with the people like Sanders and Cortez, is that at this point in time, if you were to lose a significant enough portion of the white vote that the DNC has been able to court, then you stop winning elections, because you always need that, sort of, for lack of a better term, turncoat group of white people to win you that election, because they're still the majority. And when I see people like Sanders and I see people like Cortez, they're losing them and they're pushing them more to the Republican side. So
I couldn't
even
disagree
if
with that more.
Republicans sort of suck at outreach, they almost don't need to at some point, because they're still doing the best when it comes to courting the majority demographic at this point.
Sanders is like empirically one of the most popular politicians in the country. The people who are driving white people away from the Democratic Party are more people like Nancy Pelosi, and I, I guess Cory Booker might be one. The I guess the bigger kind of like associations are like, oh, this is a party of like Black Lives Matter, or stuff like that, that really gets them going. It's
All right,
not
perhaps
like
it's
it's
not.
not social democratic politicians.
Yeah, perhaps it's not the politicians themselves, because people are often able to build a sort of cult of personality around them that enables them to ignore the issues. But the issues that the Social Democrats are championing, I feel very confident in saying, are certainly driving white people away.
Well,
What if
I'd
you?
also want to add that there's a bubble element here as well, because I think all three of us are out of a particular bubble that doesn't vote like the quote normal people being described there are voting regardless of what their ethnicity is. So, for example, Enver mentioned Nancy Pelosi just now. Like, I mean, obviously for all three of us, Nancy Pelosi is actually normal. Whereas I think that for a large portion of the voters we're actually talking about right now, Nancy Pelosi is not seen as a normal person. She's seen as kind of like something that's remote, very far away, perhaps even filled with graft and corruption, or something like this. Perhaps they perceive her in this way, whereas perhaps they perceive Ocasio Cortez as a completely different kind of brand.
Mhm.
Like she's fresh and new, and she's only been here for a short amount of time, and she doesn't collect money and disperse it to other people. Therefore, there's less of a corruption factor. Things like this. So I think they have more of an idealistic view of how politics works.
Yeah, something that somebody in the chat just pointed out, actually, which is a very good point, is that the problem even when you have sort of the social democrats championing these new sort of attractive economic policies, they're still pandering to sort of this corporatist social justice pet issues, like the Black Lives Matters and the other types of things, like the LGBTQ plus sort of things. And so,
Well, I
like,
mean, to be
even though
fair, I
Bernie
do think
was
Black
very,
Lives Matter was
progressive
organic,
in his
though.
economics, it was more so that he was still sort of mirroring Hillary's social justice points.
Well, I mean,
I
I
have
do
some
think that
things.
Black Lives Matter was organic, though. I'm not aware of that being something that was imposed from above.
Yeah, I have some things to say to Braving Ruin about all that. And it's one, the idea that like principles matter. And you know that like with Hillary Clinton, that her big thing was that people perceived her as unprincipled. They could see that Bernie was they at least perceived him to be an honest, principled person. And I think that matters to white people as well as whoever. That he was championing like issues. Oh, he was being progressive and liberal and all of these. He was hammered on all of these issues by Hillary Clinton. You can say that they weren't like that. They were true or not. I don't think that they necessarily were, but the perception was that he was a old style. Let's just have like these like a New Deal kind of Democrat kind of person. Now I'm not for like that. Here's what I will say. To say that all these cultural issues just drive people up the wall to such an extent that they're going to ignore like all of these um, like material, like they're going to ignore their material self-interest. They're going to do it if they think that the politician is conniving and is doing these things as a method of like ethnic warfare or whatever. What they are going to do is if they see someone's, oh, this is a principled stance that I am taking because I believe, not that because I'm here to represent the interests of um, like this particular ethnic group at the expense of like America or whatever. I believe that everyone deserves this. Everyone deserves these rights or what have you. If they genuinely believe that, and they don't believe that it's just a talking point, they're going to let it pass and look after their own self-interest. That's what I think.
Also, I don't agree that these social justice positions, or at least what people are calling social justice positions, I hadn't even regarded them that way until recently anyway, but I don't agree that these things are necessarily repulsive to all people who hear them. Like, I don't think they're kind of like the
No.
memes that people make them out to be. Like, I mean, let me just give a random example here. We heard, I read Alternate every now and again, right? And Alternate did a report on something that was apparently happening in large numbers of places in the US for a very long time. Um, it was called gay conversion therapy, where what they would do is they would kind of like semi abduct the children or something, and then they would take them to this weird place. And once they get there, they begin doing all these kind of weird psychologically abusive things. Right, and so I think there are real people out there who must have been through these kinds of weird processes. And so when a politician gets up on a stage and says, okay, I know that these things have been occurring, and how about we make a country in which this is not allowed to happen anymore, so these people can't do these things to you anymore, right? I'm pretty sure there's a receptive audience out there that actually looks at that and doesn't think that's some kind of like fake posturing or something, but actually sincerely believes, okay, this person is actually interested in this topic and wants to prevent this thing from happening. We do the same thing on issues of women's rights, for example. There are plenty of people who must have gone through all kinds of strange and sort of disconcerting events at the hands of men in their own local community, for example. So when Hillary Clinton gets up there and says, for example, it so happens that I am a woman and I also care about women, then I don't think that's some kind of like corporate posturing or something. There are a lot of people who would receive that message as exactly what it is.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of sincerity, and there's some weird shit that's purportedly happened in flyover country and down south, and some of these people do genuinely oppose it. But at the same time, it's not always. There's like with everything, there's always a certain amount of organicness to it. There's always a certain grain of truth to everything that's said. How much that grain is stretched and how true it actually is, of course, depends on a lot of things. But whatever grain of truth initially started these points, I would say, and drives the sincerity, has, for the most part, I would say, been lost. And that's because I think of the corporate neoliberal left and how how all these different sort of social progressives in terms of, embracing these corporations have at the same time forsaken their commitment to a more sort of radical economic outlook. Because if they were to do that, they'd have to actively come out and oppose these institutions that are supporting their social programs of change. And it's like they'd have to be constantly regging against them. And eventually, if you're actively ragging against the big money backers of the people who are
You don't have
supporting
a
your
price
social
anymore because you
agenda,
don't have any sponsors.
yeah, exactly. You run out of sponsors for your social agenda, and eventually, the tide flips. And
And
I
But
also,
this
I
is
always
also
thought
why
there
we're
was something
seeing
slightly.
such
No,
a big surge in democratic socialists right now. I'm sorry, Ray.
no, it's okay. But I was going to say this. It seems to be sort of. I hate to use the term unfair here, but I do think there's a sort of unfairness which has been levied at some of these people, because I'm thinking, okay, let's say that Hillary Clinton or Cory Booker or what's her name?
Cortez.
No. I'm talking about people's of the center.
Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris, for example. Let's say that these people do come out and say, okay, yes, we're essentially doing this halfway house thing because we have a particular social agenda within the existing capitalist system in which we need to actually take corporate donations from these individuals in order to have this thing work, right? Who are these corporate donations coming from? Like, many times it's people complaining about companies like Google or Microsoft and stuff like this. If you actually look at the things which these people are getting up to, I mean, compared to what they could be doing instead, is it really as bad as people pretend it is? Like, I mean, in contrast to what the GOP is doing. Like, which person? What I'm asking, it sounds like a strange question, but I mean, which person really? Because some of this stuff might be gaslighting. Which person really is sitting down somewhere in the south of the U.S. and is saying, you know what? I don't like the fact that Kamala Harris is perhaps in collaboration with Microsoft because that's a corrupt relationship. Therefore, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, who is in collaboration with a number of people, but including someone named Lev Leviovev, or whatever his name is, who is a blood diamond magnate who is mining diamonds illegally in somewhere in Central Africa. Like, on the scale of bad versus very bad, why should we believe that there needs to be radical changes within the Democratic Party because there are some corporate donations that happen there, when the alternative is something that's actually even worse than that?
Well, that's the thing. There's also been, I think, a
Or, for
shift
example, hold
a
on,
shift
someone's
in
also
value
mentioned here.
judgments, a shift in what is the greater good versus, or what is the lesser of two evils, I should say. And I think that's one of the big things, because what you now have amongst at least some of the, hashtag walk away crowd sort of, is this realization that they don't support these very radicalized elements at this point because, for one reason or another, it's just come so that they don't represent them. And they also see that these are larger corporate interests that Donald Trump is now railing against. And so Donald
But
Trump
he's
has
not
ended up
railing
taking up some
against
of the
them.
mantle of the DNC agenda, to some extent at least.
No, but I mean, how could they believe that, though? Like, for example, someone here has written in the chat, for example, Kamala, quote, I love big prisons, Harris. Okay, yes, it is actually true that Kamala Harris is deeply implicated in the prison system of the United States, right? Okay, but if a person is actually against that and they think that basically Kamala Harris's past is bad and she needs to come out immediately and say that she's against the private prison profit system and the schools of prison pipeline and all of that stuff, right? Let's say that people hold that grudge against her. How can the persons who believe that then turn and vote for Donald J. Trump, the same individual who actually brought back the private prison system and its associated pipeline after Barack Obama had already abolished it in 2016?
Because they
It's
don't
purely
perceive like Trump as a hypocrite. They think that, oh, this is like what he actually believes, versus like they think that the Democrats are hypocrites for like saying one thing and then doing all these other things. I think that the other thing I wanted to point out though is I feel that a lot of this operates less, at least on a national level, less on the perception of individuals like senators, unless we're talking about party leaders, and more on the level of the party itself.
Yeah,
Um,
Braving Ruin actually just made the point in chat that, to go off of your point, Enver, the DNC says one thing and then does another. And I think that's hypocrisy that's enraging more people than anything. And one of the things the DNC actually did was they came out against Bernie Sanders and condemned him for sounding like Trump over the whole Amazon thing. And they've come out and condemned him a good bit also on the whole ICE issue, where because of his refusal to abolish ICE, he's earned the ire of huge swaths of the DNC. And so there's one of the things I think the left does, and it's only become very visible, but one of the things that the left does far worse than the right or far more so than the right, I should say, is purity spiraling. And, the Soviet Union had its fair share of purity spiraling as well. But they were able to, just kind of gulag and execute their way into keeping the appearance of a united sort of party to the rest of the world. But of course, the DNC doesn't have that liberty as much as, as many potential Seth Riches as there might be. They don't quite have the liberties Stalin might have.
They're too incompetent to do it too. But
yeah.
I think that the issue of of attacking whoever, attacking Bernie and all these different things, people, I think a lot of people do get the sense that the DNC is corrupt. A lot of it comes down to, I think, the perception of Congress and the perception of our political system right now is one that people don't feel they have power in. You've characterized the U.S. system as a democracy several times in the stream. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that the U.S. is a republic and has always been so. And we really haven't seen too many cases of democracy in history, except for, in my opinion, you have ancient Greece, and then you have appearances in revolutionary moments of the dictatorship of the proletariat. To me, that is the modern reflection of the spirit of the demos and democracy and that such thing.
I think democracy in America, I think you had sort of a workable Republican democracy from, say, the inception of the country to, let's say, up until the Civil War, pretty much. I think that's a good endpoint, because from that on, I think it's fair to say that it was pretty much dominated by, you had corporate interests in the North.
You can't really describe, first of all, I think the republics and democracy are two separate things, and that we don't really see combinations of them. But I don't think it's even big. I think it's an even bigger of a stretch to say that the pre-Civil War America is a Republican democracy or something like that. When a ton of people cannot vote, franchise is very restricted, and even those who can legally vote, there's a lot more tests to see who can, and limits on and that and so forth. The Senate wasn't even directly elected for a long time. That was appointed by state governors. So I don't see how you could make that comparison.
Well, I think there's I suppose using your definition, where the sort of direct democracy is really the truest spirit of the demos, then by what you're describing, American democracy has been, far from it. But I think to the point, we're quoting him a lot, but he's making good points in the chat, so I can't help it. But Braving Ruin says he would actually agree with you, Enver, but he would go a step further in that democracy really can't even exist in a mass-scale society, or nor can a functional republic. It's really more of a plutocracy. A plutocracy
is a republic, for one, is what I would say. The second thing is that democracy isn't just kind of this directly kind of creating politics and stuff. To me, it reflects one very simple fact, and that is that the elite fear the masses to such a systemic and direct extent that they are bowed to them in everything that they do. Mm-hmm. It's not the non-existence of elites. That's not really possible. But it's it's my pinned tweet, basically, that the strong fear the weak.
Yeah, no, I think there's also something to the idea that it's probably not the best idea to let the masses rule, to let the mob rule. I'm no fan of democracy, and I've stated this openly on the streams, because quite frankly, I don't believe the average person has a right to be involved in political matters, because I don't think the average person is of the caliber where they should be deciding the political fate of their fellow patriots.
I don't think our elites have really been up to the task either, but
no, we have the quality of our elites has decreased greatly, because they've become they used to be sort of a philosopher king elite, at least what you saw in absolutist Europe to some extent. And they've now become sort of a merchant elite, where the only hierarchy of systems that actually matters is a system of who can exchange what commodity for which, or exchange what property, what stake in this corporation for another. And when you have a system of meritocracy based solely on material things, you're not going to get a hierarchy and an elite that actually cares
Wait,
about
but when were they not doing that? Because, like, for instance, you mentioned
absolute.
autocracy in Europe,
He's
absolutist
talking
Europe,
about
for example.
feudalism.
Oh, yeah, I mean, wasn't that also based on assets? I'm pretty sure
No.
that was based on material
I
assets.
mean, to some extent, yeah, you can't
Landlords, that's what it is,
abstract
right?
the material assets of the privatized kingdoms of Europe, so to speak, from what they were. But at the same time, it wasn't about the property; it was about their rule and actually satisfying the people. Because the way the kings ruled, the people were sort of like livestock, essentially, to them. The people were their assets. And so, in order to increase the value of their property and increase the value of themselves, thereby, they would have to actually care for the people, and they would actually have to give a shit about the people. Now, you
No,
may
but
say,
isn't that literally the description of why we have this thing called liberal democracy as well? Because if you scroll back earlier into this conversation, like for instance, when we were talking about increasing the overall productivity of the human beings and making sure that everyone has the mandatory education and so on, isn't that the exact same process you just described?
let's repeat that
I would
again. I
like
didn't
to.
quite follow that.
Okay, you said just now that you believe that there was a closeness between the ruler and the ruled in the case of absolutist Europe because one of the great assets that they possessed was in fact the people themselves. But earlier on, when we were talking about the educational system, for example, was that not the exact same thing in the modern era that we were treating the children as though they are the assets which are going to be leveraged?
No, it was a different type of assets here because what the king would use his people for in terms of, the building of his society is much different than
They were
what the modern
farmers.
educational system uses its students for. Like students today, I think the communist critique of what students are today as they're just being trained to be, cogs in the greater neoliberal machine to just make
That's
money,
Foucault.
have kids, and reproduce. I think that's a very accurate critique, and I think it's
Yeah,
very,
wasn't the
very
same
true.
thing happening in absolutist Europe though, which is basically you have your basic level 1 peasant, and then you kind of like level it up to a level 30 peasant, which then I guess has sex with another level 30 peasants, and then you've got some more peasants, and you continue doing this. Like it's kind of like I'm not sure how the peasants are not cogs in a machine here.
Well,
I'd
they're
like to
cogs in a
return.
different machine. Everybody is a cog in some machine. That's just the process of human civilization. I don't deny that. But the type of cog that they were wasn't simply one in a materialist game. Like, even though the standard of living for a peasant was much materially lower than what it is today, you could make the case that they were a much more fulfilled and satisfied people in that there was a spiritual and cultural enrichment that existed at that period because of not only localization, but even some of the universals that exist. Like the first really globalizing force of the ancient world was essentially the Catholic Church, and it's the
Sure.
reach it had all over Europe. And that
No,
was
but
sort of
wasn't No, but I mean, that's just one of those things where I kind of get the feeling that it's kind of like we're doing kind of a noble savage thing, except we're doing it in a slightly different way. Because if we were to compare what they did to what we have now, it's kind of like the candle does not compare. I mean, they have an empire in which large numbers of people are illiterate and therefore cannot actually read the communications to understand the mass culture that's being created in the first place.
I would like to go back to something in
Also,
regard.
just before you go forward as well, in terms of the spreading of in terms of the spreading of the globalization and so on, I think the first globalization was actually done by Genghis Khan, was it not?
yeah,
It was a,
very. It's a
a
very.
merchant. It was certainly a merchant.
Uh-huh.
It depends on what you're talking about by globalization, because certainly Genghis Khan was globalist in his type of imperialism, but I'm referring more to a soft sort of globalization, which I think the Catholic Church was much better at.
And he was explicitly, if you follow his path as well, he explicitly moved along trade routes.
Mhm.
And so his form of unification was essentially people have to trade with each other, and in the consequence, you might actually end up trading some culture along with it. Obviously,
Yeah,
there's severe violence along with this, of course, but
yeah, because
I'm
culture
just
isn't something that's just, written down. I think, as you're sort of getting at, culture is something that's lived. So even if the peasantry can't necessarily understand the deep philosophical works that might be sort of influencing the background to the culture they're living out, they're still living and participating in it. And so it's not fair to say just because they're not reading in it, they're not in any meaningful way engaging in it either.
oh yeah, I'll give you that, but it is so much easier if they can read and if they do have the opportunities that we're talking about, obviously. And so I don't agree with this idea that it was uniformly better in the past compared to how it is now. Because if you want to
No, no,
build
no.
a mass culture now, it's incredibly easy. I
I'm
mean,
not making the
even if
case
you
that
look
it's
at
uniformly better. I'm not trying to say that at all. I'm just saying, in a
even if you
spiritual and self-fulfillment sort of sense, I think it would have been
But
better back then.
you're,
But I
you're
mean, even if
doing
you look at
this
something
thing.
quite meme-worthy, like the People's Republic of China, for example, in a very short period of time, if you start from I guess 1948 to present, they've essentially built something. They've essentially built something that never existed before. And how did they do it? They leveraged exactly the kind of tools that you would also have a liberal democracy leverage, which is basically everyone went to the same school, everyone learned basically the same thing, books were put out, everyone had to read the books, and it went on this way until now you've got this thing that everyone recognizes as actually being a country. Because prior to 1948, China was actually not really a country. It was a set of, I guess you could call it, 12 warlords were prancing around pretending that they were grand landowners and everyone was
Yeah.
shooting in each other's direction. That's basically what it was. And now it's somehow something completely different. And so
You
I
know,
don't think it's impossible to build a culture.
I
No, no,
think
no.
that
Yes. Sorry, go
when
on,
you're
Edgar.
talking about like, well, oh, we there's two things there to unwrap. You have like the culture, like the great feudal Catholic culture going on that you want to get back to. That having a backward kind of look like that, that even if you could say, oh, the way we want to reproduce that now, we could say it would be we keep certain material advantages. You want to have us return to a situation like the undercurrent of that was feudalism on like material level, and like I'm going to be the old stereotypical grouchy Marxist here. Culture is downstream of all of these material, the mode of production, basically,
Mhm.
and it's not this kind of thing that you can just kind of pick and choose whatever you want. You can have like and it goes to like the whole the Nietzsche thing of like God is dead or whatever. It's you can't just like put the cat back into the bag without like um, going back to this kind of primitive mode of production that is reactionary and progressive, and I don't think could meet the needs of people as it is today.
Well,
The other thing, no, there's another thing here talking about with philosopher kings that really doesn't sit well with me because philosopher kings is a made up thing. The Plato was just wanted himself in power because he thought he was very smart. This idea that we can like it's one like I can see that like it's kind of shared by both like Catholics, neoclassical economists, and Mark and certain utopian kind of communists of like a beneficial kind of overlord leader thing. But it's not like a real thing, and I would hope you knew that. That like the reason I'm for that kind of demos and kind of stuff, and you see this very clearly if you read this section of the Athenian constitution written by this guy called the Old Oligarch, who's basically saying, yes, the demos, you could say they have bad government and whatnot, but it's bad government with them in charge. They don't want to be slaves to someone and have good government. And that's basically the same arrangement I am willing to make because I don't want to be a cuck and sit around and be a slave to whoever.
yeah. Well, so a couple of things there. First and foremost, materialism is the big metaphysical gay. First off, but
Okay, I'll accept that. You, you know
but
what?
well, no, it's just the larger point of material relations being the driving force behind sort of the dialectic is something that I
I
think
don't believe in
is
dialectics, but continue.
okay. Well, just to kind of use appropriate some of the communist language as I can relate to it as I've been reading some of Hegel, but
Well, Hegel wasn't a communist, but
no, oh no, I know. I view communism as sort of like the child that
the
survived
ultimate
the
Hegelian
abortion of
project.
Hegel. Yeah, it's sort of a alien project to Hegelianism. It's like they've taken something that was, pure idealism and made it materialism, and it's a befuddling thing to watch when you actually understand like the source literature to even
Well, that's
a
why I
small
discard
small
Hegel
extent.
and just kind of take everything from like that Althusian
Malthusian.
kind of perspective.
Sure. Okay.
There is something to that though, which is that when Ember said earlier that you can't put the cat back into the box without causing other effects to happen, I mean there is some truth to that. For example, if you were to try to restore these traditional values and so on, which were designed for the purpose of buttressing a feudal system, you then can't be entirely surprised to find out that you end up in a semi-feudal system when you have done this.
Yeah. Well, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, if I'm being quite frank. But my larger point is that this idea that this sort of cultural concept only exists when there are certain institutions about, like, say, the People's Republic of China, or that culture only exists in these certain places and times when there are certain representations of them. I think is sort of it's a too materialistic view of culture. Like, culture is something that's very uh, it's very much like a form, to put it in Platonic terms. It's something that's lived, that everyone tries to, get a better grasp of, that nobody really has the perfect grasp of, but everybody can articulate to some extent where it's coming from and what they're striving for. And so this idea that, you need these institutions to sort of imbibe them, or you need some sort of codified, written down letter for the people, I think is, it's just superfluous. It'd be interesting to have something like that to sort for a historical and record and maybe some sort of philosophical exposition, but the lived experience of the people who are in the middle of that culture, in the middle of that ideology, is far more valuable than just the what happens to come out of it in terms of institutional or literary reference. Like, sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, how does it maintain its inertia then if it doesn't produce these things, though?
How does
I would add to that
it doesn't need inertia as a culture. If it's manifesting organically, then it's just organic. You'd need inertia to change it from what it was.
But I would.
Well, of course, I'm making the assumption that culture is constantly subjecting itself to change on its own terms, which is why, for example, what is the definition of ethno-nationalism, for example? Usually the definition is something like seeking to maintain control over a specific geographic breeding group in its own, oh goodness, in its own civic space. So
Sure.
why is it phrased like that as opposed to we're seeking to statically preserve culture? Why? Well, the reason is because of the fact that it's expected that culture is constantly changing to adapt to the material circumstances, and therefore this is why even when you look at some of the most reactionary ethno-nationalist ideas that have come out, for example, I'm going to sort of slightly put Japan under the bus a little bit here with the with the thing about the Japanese uniqueness concept. And the Japanese concept of internationalization. These two things actually interlock together, right? Even in these cases, because these things are not entirely sophisticated, they're kind of like a sledgehammer. You're taking a sledgehammer to kind of cut a piece of paper or something. But even these take into account the culturism, the constant renovation, and that therefore what's being preserved is not necessarily the culture itself, but rather the sovereignty of the Japanese people over the editorial process of how that culture shall be modified when necessary.
Okay.
These are two very different things. Preserving the culture is different from preserving your editorial rights over it.
No, that's absolutely true. And I understand. Like, obviously, you're talking to someone here who, metaphysically speaking, is a dualist. And so there's both a spiritual interplay here and a material interplay here that I would grant are both valid and both have sort of this back and forth between each other. Like, it's sort of like the difference between a sort of national socialistic material sort of racism and something like an Evolian spiritual sort of racism, to give it very esoteric sort of terminology. But either way, I'm not looking at it from pure idealism or pure materialism one way or another. Obviously, there are people who are going to edit the culture somewhat through like their lived experiences, and as their lived experiences change with the material, the culture is going to change. But at the same time, the foundation for that material basis and wanting to improve it or wanting to go back to something, in like the case of what I might advocate, is based on some sort of spiritual longing or spiritual desire for something greater that might need to be met in the material plane.
What happens when it butts up against
Grand Hegelian coming at us again? Did I want to like point something out to you? The way
Hegel was an idealist.
Yes, he was, And the problem with that, what you run into with social reproduction theory, is that it's not just like all these grand ideas about rationality and human improvement and stuff that drives change. And the way the world changes around us predominantly happens to be the necessity of reproducing the world around us so that it continues. That in capitalism, that's maintaining capital going and all the things that it entails. You need labor, you need all these raw materials, you need what have you. You need ideological control, all these things. It's to say that there's such. I honestly, I fault Marx for this too. I do. That he was saying, "Oh, we haven't gotten to the point where we'll be able to fully consciously control, um, like our economic social life, because of history is still ongoing. Capitalism determines all these different things, but eventually we'll get there." I don't think that's possible, and I don't. And the reason why is you said it earlier: is that ideology is a trans-historical force. Well, I'm summarizing something, a sentiment I think you've expressed.
Yeah, sure.
And it's something that I think is fundamentally going to prevent that. That's something that I think is a barrier to this idea of um, human rationality and desire for improvement being the true guiding force of history.
Yeah, well, I'm not maybe I should correct myself from earlier then. I'm not under this belief. I'm not a historical determinist in any sense, in the same way that Hegel was, as he expressed it in his philosophy of history. I don't believe that there's anything in particular that we're moving towards, or that ideology, even though it's sort of like this trans historical force, is pushing us towards. Rather, I think that it's a trans historical force that sort of encompasses the whole of our interactions. And we have, in the same way that we interplay with it and modify it with it, the ideology that existed before and the ideology that will exist interplays with us. There is no, it's sort of like the relationship, to relate it back to something we talked about earlier, between education and the economic output. There's further, the growth of economic output in some way, shape, or form will provide more educational opportunities, and the population can grow greater in its knowledge. But at the same time, if you have a population that's growing greater in its knowledge, it will begin to produce more economically. Like, there's no set direction in which this sort of interplay happens. And I think on a grand scale, you could say the same thing about spiritual and cultural forces versus material forces.
There is a wonderful concept that I'd like to introduce you to. It's that Althusser kind of coined. Well, he took this term from psychology and he applied it to this kind of theory of history and all this kind of stuff. It's overdeterminism, and I think it's kind of closely linked. It kind of interplays with his more later theory of aleatory materialism, which basically is more like stochastic materialism. This idea of, yes, you can't really, and I fault Marx for this as well, is that you can't directly say that this material change causes this like ideological impact, but it does have a probabilistic kind of semi-random impact, and it is always going both ways. And but I think this is a further barrier of like us being able to control history in a conscious way. But that
Well,
doesn't mean that history still isn't moving in a certain like probabilistic direction.
okay, I would.
You can
I
sometimes
think.
see it. You
Sorry,
can
go ahead,
sometimes
Ray.
see it in the way that these things play out. Though there was a, I guess you could call it a game if you want to call it a game, but um, after the after Neo-Confucianism became a thing, this is a really simplified version of this story that I'm giving here. But after Neo-Confucianism became a thing, there were obviously rule books that were written out during the time periods as to how people should behave in particular social contexts and the responsibilities and duties which people have. And so one of one of the big theorists on this was Seika Fujiwara, right? And if you actually go and you were to open the book the book that he had on, I think it was the book on filial piety and the behavior of women or something like this. Yeah, there was a lot of things that he described in these texts. If you was actually just get a summation, a summary of what the contents of the text is, and you were to essentially enumerate these things as rules, and then compare them to what actually the people chose to do in reaction to industrial development, you will actually see. You can actually mark off the times at which each one of these rules was effectively removed from the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that people essentially looked at it and thought, yeah, we're not doing that one anymore. And then it continued on, and oh yeah, we're also not doing that one anymore. It's almost as if the entire book now, if you were to look at any of Fujiwara Seiga's books, all of the contents of those books might as well be blank pages now. They may as well be blank pages, but they sit here and they're very historical. And so I still remain convinced that there is in fact a material aspect to this.
Yeah,
and that material contingencies that are imposed on a country will indeed cause people to say, well, it's not really conducive to my survival if I continue to behave in this particular way, so we're going to abandon this system of belief and innovate another one.
I
Modify
agree.
it in some way.
I agree that necessity kind of makes things more direct sometimes.
Yeah.
I would never go up against necessity.
Yeah, obviously, but there is even need itself, like beyond the very base physiological things of what we describe as need. Need can indeed itself become somewhat of a subjective term, especially when we're talking about psychological fulfillment and we're trying to move higher up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I think it's something of, you can obviously use material conditions, probabilistic models to gain a fairly accurate picture of the direction of a nation. It's been mentioned in the chat a couple times. People like Pat Buchanan, whose book I have with me. Where is it? I think it's The Death of the West. He is probably one of the more profound paleo-conservative right-wing pundits to come out of 20th century right-wing America. And the predictions that he makes in that book based on immigration trends and certain cultural trends have for the most part been completely vindicated. So I wouldn't sit here and try to deny to you guys that there is a very material element at play here, but at the same time, the reaction to that material element and the longing for the period of the time before that, even if it means the surrender of what we've gained materialism in terms of material standard of living, is something that isn't explained away just by material forces, because you now have people willing to forsake that materialism. And so I think,
Oh, of
again,
course, sometimes that can certainly happen. I mean, one of the biggest cases of witnessing that, other than Afghanistan, which is an obvious case, would be Iran.
Yeah, sure.
Iran essentially just, I don't know how you want to describe it. I mean, from my perspective, I see it as it shot itself in its own leg. But basically, 1979 happened.
Yeah.
I think that there's a word for what you're going for, pragmatic. And Marx coined it in the Communist Manifesto. Well, actually, it's two words, and it's the reactionary socialists. He had a whole section on them. All the people who were like, yes, we're for socialism, and we're like, but we're all the aristocrats and the monarchs and all those kind of people, and we're going to go back to the spiritual time and stop like worrying about these commodity relations and stuff. The reason Marx was opposed to them, of course, was because they are reactionary in a sense that they are against like economic development, progress, all these like human liberation too. They are for yes, let's get rid of commodity relations, but let's replace them with these older, more dominating hierarchical relations that were like still like very oppressive to people and like
Yeah. Somebody in the chat actually gave us a name. It's, I think, what he's telling me Marx identified it as was called feudal socialists, which
he called them that as well, but the header of the section was reactionary socialists.
Okay. Well, I think you could almost call a reactionary socialist a fascist as well. I don't think that would be an inaccurate descriptor.
It really refers to two separate things, because fascism was considered a route to modernity, whereas reactionary socialists were like going back to like those earlier eras.
Okay.
Exactly, and I've long argued, by the way, although people give me flack for this each time, I've long argued that the reactionary is in fact more dangerous than the fascist.
Yes.
It's interesting because to me, when I hear those two terms, I see them largely as almost, they have a similar cultural anthropology, and they're sort of sisters of, or stepsisters of sort, in terms of ideology, because I see fascism almost as, I know this isn't technically the right political anthropology, but fascism as simply a branch of being a neo-reactionary per se.
I'm not sure I don't agree, of course. The program of fascism was certainly part of modernity, and that many of um, its initial forays were attempts to actually showcase that modernity. So, for example, people often talk about Japanese fascism. For example, what was Japanese fascism's first actual action? The first
Uh,
action, well,
Asian co-prosperity sphere, I think.
no, that was quite later on. The first
Okay.
action, the first two actions, I guess you'd say, is trying to use Taiwan as a showcase, which was, massive progressive attempts were made there. So, for example, mandatory school was one of the things that was brought in, and then there was the whole "you must send girls to school" thing, which they did. Um, and also abolishing foot binding in the in Taiwan as well. The other thing that was done was the issue of unions, which is that the beginning of Hideki Tojo's rise actually came from the fact that I think it was the Fishmongers Union or something, or it was a Fishmongers Union and a bunch of other unions were being told by capitalists at the time that they need to basically stand down and stop making aggressive demands. And these were obviously nationalist unions. These were not unions of the left, unfortunately, but they were still unions nonetheless. And so what happened one day was that the capitalists decided they were going to call in something that they called reconciliation by sword, which is a very, very euphemistic way of saying that they're going to ask the police to come and beat up the unions and send them home. And so what they did was they essentially called up and said, okay, are we going to do reconciliation by sword? And the police said yes. And then they came. The police came, looked from side to side, looked at the two sides, and saw that the capitalists were standing there looking very arrogant in front of their factories. And then the police themselves crossed the line and joined the unions. And from that point onward, Hideki Tojo was going to become prime minister.
Okay, so
And
I
so
think
reactionary, and so that is why I'm saying that the comparison between fascism and reactionaries, on the other hand, these two things are completely different.
yeah, well,
Well, I
I
would
think
say that,
there's a bit of an accurate description. I think again, coming from chat, from Rodin, that fascism seeks to achieve reactionary ends via modernistic methods, which I think is quite aptly what you sort of described Tojo did.
I want to talk to what Brave and Gruen just posted about, like, what is progress if it robs people of a sense of purpose. What people are, this robbing of purpose is something that certainly come with modernity, um, or post-modernity, what have you. It's not like the struggle, I think, for progress is a sense of purpose in of itself, and it's certainly a purpose that has given many like communists, socialists, and so on. Not just some, but like the working class people all across the world, certainly hope for like a certain liberatory project, a project that is one like for material economic development, but not just because, oh, this, we are all like materialists now, all we care about are these things. No, it's to free us up to care about all of these personal relationships, even spiritual things, but spiritual things looking forward,
Well,
not
you
just being nostalgic and what have you.
well, you
It,
sort of rob yourself of a chance at spiritual meaning, or attempting to, you know, at least pretend to wave the banner of spiritual meaning, if you're endorsing the materialist
No, I
metaphysics.
disagree 100%. And I'm also going, I'll cite two things here. The first one is Zizek, of
I
course.
knew you were going to say that.
Because one of the things that he talks about often is Christians are, or Christians or former Christians are the only ones who can be true materialist, atheist kind of thing. Not atheists in the sense that they don't believe in God, but they don't believe in this kind of spiritual, idealist kind of world going on here on earth. They believe that God is in heaven. That is the realm of spirituality and all things. We live on earth in this realm of harsh materiality. and that is how we must understand the things around us. The other
Yeah.
thing that I would like to say is that it's I grew up in a Catholic church. I grew up in the Church of Saint Francis of Assisi, and that was that. It's a church that, like Saint Francis is the patron saint of children and animals.
He's my
Um,
confirmation saint, just to let you know. So
oh,
I'm
I'm
well
sure you're
aware
quite
of
familiar.
a lot of his stories and like the story of his life and such.
Yes, yeah, it's. I think it's a very compelling story,
Oh yes.
and I think that that kind of um, it's a certain sense of spirituality that I think is can be forward looking. It doesn't have to be grounded like you are, not necessarily in a sense, but maybe a little of nostalgia for feudal certainty of spirituality and all these kinds of things. Zizek kind of makes the point that like the true faith, and I kind of agree with him here, that the true faith is always believing even to the contrary of every single thing, that it is like the faith remains in spite of all of this um, monstrous materialism, what have you.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I
and
would just to kind of interject here. I think Zizek is sort of blinded in large part by in the endorsement of this materialist metaphysic, not because like when I listen to him describe things like love, I essentially hear him describing lust most of the time. And I think to myself, well, why is he making this conflation when what I hear him describing is really lust? And I think to myself, well, it's because he doesn't really conceive of love as anything
I
beyond
disagree
material.
100% completely, and because the way he describes love is that no, you see perfection in through all of this massive imperfection of a person. When you're like, I think feeling lust, you're kind of feeling that, oh, I am seeing this perfection by glazing over all of these imperfections. No,
Mm,
love is seeing the imperfections too.
well, love is he's big about acknowledging contradictions as he is with all things. But I
Mhm.
think he's when it comes to when he's describing love, it's sort of this overbearing type of, you know, the imperfection is just a part of the material, and what you're looking at isn't really, is just like this material imperfection. And even though
I
love,
don't think that like he uses
it's
material
sort of the myth
imperfections
of
as like an
Sisyphus on a
example.
grand scale. Like he sort of applies like this idea that, meaning in through the pure struggle or through acknowledgement of imperfection is sort of like what I could describe his philosophy as writ large, even though it's sort of that's a very, very broad and far too generalized
But
description.
I would say that that's true even of like the human soul or what have you, if you want to go deeper like that. That people on the inside are deeply imperfect. And that's like the deeper, if you want to love someone, you have to recognize that, recognize their imperfections, and kind of um, just still love them, not just in spite of that, but also because of those things. Um, and that is, I mean that on like not just like the as Rodin puts it, love is a brain chemical kind of way. I mean that in both like a spiritual and deeply personal, interpersonal kind of way.
Yeah, I think all of these cases become infinitely harder to make when you're trying to reduce it down to the material thing. Because to get back to sort of my
Well, I
Zizek,
still, I still don't agree with what Raven Ruin said there either. When he says it robs people of a sense of purpose, I just don't agree because I actually think that progress itself is part of the purpose. And I'm not
Yeah.
going to use my own words for this one. I'm going to quote from someone I think you all will be familiar with from the Third World, Michaela Flack, who is the designer of the Ba'ath Party ideology.
Mm.
Right? So I'm just going to quote two quotes from him. I can't. I would quote also from Salah al-Din al-Bitar, but I can't find any of his quotes, so I just don't have them on hand. But I do have Aflaq, so you're going to get some Aflaq now. Two quotes. So the first one is from the Ba'ath Party newspaper from 7th of February 1950. And this piece is titled, and it's just literally just one sentence, it's titled, "Progressiveness is the way to be in touch with our past." Quote, Progressivism in its real significance is nothing but the recommencement of the march of the nation in its living and ascending history before it underwent degeneration. The liberation which we call for is nothing but a liberation from the fetters and residues which accumulated in this nation during that long period in which it stopped marching, and to be in touch with the genuine fountainhead of its spirit. And then the
But what
second
is he?
quotation.
Well, I just stop you right there because what would he describe? Again, when we use terms like progress, I can't imagine progress in the Ba'athist sense would be even remotely similar to what the neoliberal progressive endorses as progress. And so we run into this problem again
Well,
of,
obviously, there's a time difference, of course, because
yeah, that as well.
the things that he viewed as progressive out there, but obviously seen as just pedestrian by us now. But I mean, if you're in the middle of
Those
Arab
things as actual
society,
progress in the first place.
but I mean, if you're in his position, just standing in the middle of a very backward Arab society and advocating the kind of things that the Ba'ath Party was advocating at that time, then yes, objectively speaking, they would be the progressives in that situation. And so, obviously, his reaction here and why he's defensive about this word progressive must have been because, in the context, people were telling him off for using this term, and then he was saying, "Well, progressivism just means this."
Yeah,
And
well,
I'll give the second quote now as well. This one is from 28th of May 1969, in which he's titled this "The Working Class is the Hope of the Future." And so, quotation, quote, "For socialism, in order to acquire a meaning, scope, and to be of benefit, the nation must survive, the homeland must be safeguarded. We have to save the land and protect it. We must restore the plundered soil and stand up in the face of all imperialist and Zionist plots. As you know, this is the distinctiveness of your party, for it has not become satisfied with half-truths. It has not stood in mid-air. It has stood from its inception, from the outset, on solid ground, because it has combined the goals of the popular masses in just and dignified life with the relation of these masses to a soil, a homeland, a heritage, history, independence, and a restoration of unity of all parts of this nation, which otherwise would have been lost. The task of the working class is to produce with one hand and to fight by the other, or, if necessary, to fight with the two hands and defer everything else, for rescuing the homeland from aggression and imperialist threats is superior to every other task." End quote.
yeah, sure. I can,
So, I mean,
like a lot of,
he would self-describe as a progressive in that case, because you're not going to be able to be capable of doing that if you regress into the past. And we know this because, I mean, look at the fate of other organizations in the Middle East that have attempted from the outset to just go back to feudalism. They just get bombed instantly and they're destroyed. How long did
yeah.
Baathism last? I mean, Baathism has lasted so long that Assad is still there despite everyone trying to destroy his party.
Yeah, well, I think the big thing, I know, Enver, you want to address Braving Ruin's point, but I'll just
No,
briefly.
I really I addressed it. That's all I'm gonna say.
Okay, but what you just described, and I think what largely has been the sort of overtone of this Ba'athist, greater national socialist kind of thing, is that what you described largely I would view as sort of an ecological progressivism, and certainly that's how Hitler gained some power as well. He was sort of an ecological nut himself, and he for his time he was indeed a quote unquote progressive in the things he ended up implementing in terms of social policy as well. The issue is at what point do you decide this much progress is enough and this much is going too far? At what point does progress for progress sake actually lose its meaning, or does it not? And does this eventual nightmare of sort of consumerism just continue onwards and onwards if we're to look at it from the materialist framework?
Well, I think consumerism, for one, is historically contingent phenomena that doesn't necessarily have to continue into the future, just as it hasn't always existed, even particularly in commercial society, pre-capitalism. It's um, it's one of those things that I think, uh, like, as whatever kind of social relations comes after capitalism. Okay, actually, let me put this a different way. It can be historically contingent. There is always the contingency to the contingency, if you'll excuse the expression, that things could just um, kind of go in a nightmare scenario forever. That's always a real possibility. Um, Certainly, the right wing kind of view has right wing capitalist point of view is that either that capitalism will continue on forever, or as like automation or singularity kind of happens, it still happens in the framework of capital, basically, and continues those kinds of logic and relations. Um, I think that so long as I think that that is possible if like the capitalist class is the driving like force of whatever comes next. Our biggest hope, I think, is hoping that that's a different class kind of pushes for something different.
I mean, at the end of the day, I can't necessarily disagree with that. Of course, we're going to end up disagreeing on, which direction, how we build something out of the ruins we've currently been given, both socially and economically and spiritually and whatever else you want to throw in there. But I think I'm going to just, on that note, I think I'm going to end it. Even though me and Ray didn't actually get to talk about the big topic of contention we ended off on last time, I guess this means there's going to have to be a part 3.
I'd love to take part.
Yes, I think so.
All right.
I mean,
well,
unless you do want to do it now, but I mean, it's really late.
Yes.
yeah, it's pretty late by me too, and I actually have some summer classes to get to, so I'll call it here, and I'll leave the audience with bated breath upon the expectation of Authoritarian at Different Ends Part 3.
Awesome.
So thank you guys for joining me again. This is once again a very insightful and enlightening conversation in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, it's been a great stream. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been pretty good.
All right. So, and thank you, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us in the chat and contributing to the conversation as well. And I'll see you all in the future. Good night.